Chapter 724. The true meaning behind the warning. Upon hearing Helmasuin's reply, Klein couldn't help but twitch the corner of his lips. He nearly froze on the spot. My enemies aren't in Byam. Even if you were to die at Sea King's doorstep, it wouldn't be of much use. He slowly drew a breath and didn't continue the topic. Instead, he asked, Helmasuin, no, Mr. Hilarion, how did you notice me? You even came here before your death to specially warn me. This was also the puzzlement he had towards Rhodes and Rionette Tinker. He just never had a chance to ask them. With the door in between them, Helmasuin fell silent for 2 seconds. Then, he said with a smile in his tone, there are some tiny unique traits about you. In high-level creatures of the spirit world, it's no secret. It's noticeable as long as they make contact with you in close proximity. After all, the gray fog that represents the great ruler of the spirit world is above our heads. Deities with certain unique authorities or beyonders who represent fate can also discover this point to a certain extent. Of course, the premise is that close contact has to be made. Gray fog. Although Orange Light's explanation and Rhodes's compliments are nearly identical, he is the first person I've met that directly pointed out the gray fog to me to my face. Therefore, the mysterious space is the divine kingdom above the spirit world left behind by the great ruler? Which sequence 0 pathway is this? The deities who can discover that I'm augmented by the gray fog include the Mother Tree of Desire, so she was able to target me? Klein's thoughts bubbled like boiling water as all sorts of questions popped in his head. Just as he was about to speak, Helmasuin had continued, in Yellow Light's prophecy, the great ruler above the spirit world is one of the variables of the apocalypse. However, I cannot be sure that you are equivalent to him. There are too many possibilities for you that allow that unique trait. For example, you being his blessed, his child, or his chosen oracle, but none of this stops me from expressing my friendship. Ahem. You know about Backlund Stock Exchange, right? You're like a railway company that just got listed. You seem to have a bright future ahead. Some people will naturally think well of you and purchase a certain number of shares, but there will be no lack of people who are greedy. They wish to use other means to seize this company or obtain the controlling rights. I'm part of the former, while Mother Tree of Desire and even more powerful spirit world creatures are part of the latter. Does that so? If it wasn't because the transmigrator, Emperor Roselle, who existed before me, had some level of interaction with the gray fog, and if I hadn't divined my origins in that mysterious space and received clear scenes of Earth, allowing me to recall even more of my memories, I would have suspected if I was the reincarnation of the great ruler above the spirit world. Taking everything into account from this experience, Emperor Roselle and I are more like the chosen oracles. The great ruler above the gray fog is equivalent to the celestial worthy of heaven and earth? Klein couldn't help but generate all kinds of conjectures as his mind was in a mess like a cat playing a ball of yarn. He calmed his emotions and said, Is there any way to hide this unique trait? Become a demigod. Helmasuin suddenly coughed after answering. Do you mind if I die at your doorstep? Klein didn't wish to draw the attention of Sea King John Cotman, Naval Admiral Robert Davis, and other demigods. Helmasuin munched at his sweet and said, Then, I'll have to leave immediately, or else there wouldn't be time. After you become a demigod and have the powers to probe deep into the spirit world, we might have a chance of meeting. Klein was silent for 2 seconds before saying, Thank you for your warning, Mr. Hilarion. Helmasuin didn't reply as he lumbered to the staircase. As he listened to the footsteps down the stairs, Klein focused. Suddenly, he had a certain theory about why Emperor Roselle had failed to enter despite discovering the existence of the gray fog. He restored that silver plate which resulted in his transmigration far after he became a Beyonder. As for me, I was already an ordinary person when I attempted the luck enhancement ritual again. Also, Emperor Roselle chose the savant pathway, while I took the seer pathway. The mysterious space above the gray fog clearly provides great aid in divination. Therefore, the prerequisites for entering the space above the gray fog is to be an ordinary person or be a Beyonder of the seer pathway, as well as knowing of the corresponding incantation, rituals, and symbols. The Emperor's experiments were too late, and he had chosen the wrong pathway, so he naturally had no means of entering it. With how the seer, apprentice, and marauder pathways are considered neighboring pathways, perhaps the former two would work too. Could this be the deeper reason why the emperor made the poignant point in his diary that he should have chosen one of these three pathways? Apart from not having any sequence 0 for these three pathways, preventing any influence from the peak, it's also the key to entering the gray fog? As his thoughts churned, Klein placed this matter, which he couldn't obtain any confirmation of, at the back of his mind. He began considering Orange Light Hilarian's warning. Be careful of the mother tree of desire. Due to the incident as Admiral Emirius, Klein was rather wary against the mother tree of desire. He had no choice but to change his identity and use the need for him to act, so as to hide for 2 months. Subsequently, he wasn't too willing to provoke Admiral of Blood and other members of the Rose School of Thought, afraid that he would fall into a trap. Towards the extreme danger lurking around, a normal human's first thought was to resolve the matter. It was likewise the same for Klein. However, the problem was that he had no solutions. The mother tree of desire was suspected to be a sequence 0 true god located in the astral world. Even if Klein jumped up, there was no way he could hit her or defeat her. And the faction, the Rose School of Thought, that she controlled was an organization with quite a long history. It likely had angels presiding over it and had grade 0 sealed artifacts. Otherwise, it was very difficult for them to survive to this day with the churches and all the secret organizations at odds with it. Therefore, even if Klein had plans of getting the help of Mr. Azik or other powerful figures, there was no way he could uproot the Rose School of Thought. It was even possible that they would encounter danger. Due to these reasons, Klein could only hide and hope that he could successfully advance to sequence 4 and become a demigod. I've always been careful against the mother tree of desire. Mr. Orange Light Hilarian didn't know that I once fell for the evil god's trap at Oravi Island? Or did he specially come over to warn me that she would be doing something major soon? He was previously under Admiral of Blood's control, and Admiral of Blood is a member of the Rose School of Thought. He might very well know of something. Klein was instantly alarmed. He didn't just blindly believe that a faceless transformation was enough to fool the mother tree of desire's attention. According to Orange Light Hilarian's explanation, she would be able to discover certain unique traits when in close proximity with me. This is something the faceless Beyonder powers are unable to mask. She hasn't done anything in a while. Could it be that she is attempting to use the sensation to bestow something to her believers through some ritual or item, and that she is about to succeed soon? Klein slowly frowned as he felt that it was certainly a possibility. This made him more eager to return to Backland. In that huge city, even angels had to behave themselves, just like a particular snake of fate. The believers of the Mother Tree of Desire and the powerhouses of the Rose School of Thought were unable to act as they wished. All they could do was wait for an opportunity. Klein exhaled and headed above the gray fog. He divined if his life would be in danger soon. This time, he received a negative answer. His life wouldn't be in danger. However, Klein didn't relax as a result. He recalled that the Mother Tree of Desire's divination interference could penetrate the gray fog's shielding to a certain extent. And very long ago, his spirituality had prevented him from divining the werewolf Beyonder characteristic above the gray fog. This was because it might very well involve the Chained God, and the Chained God was suspected to be another manifestation of the Mother Tree of Desire. Either there's really nothing going on and that I'm overthinking matters, or the danger is already very close. That's why the Mother Tree of Desire took action to interfere. To be safe, I need to make preparations. Even if it's proven to be a false alarm, it's still better than being captured by the Rose School of Thought and taken away by the Mother Tree of Desire to perform some unspeakable matters. Klein immediately returned to the real world and took out a pen and paper before quickly writing a letter. He started with, "Dear Mr. Azik, considering how the underworld was inside the spirit world, that the demigods of the death pathway were considered high-ranking spirit world creatures in a certain way, and that Mr. Azik might be able to see his unique trait after he recovered his memory," Klein was rather honest. He directly wrote about the entire conversation between Orange Light Hilarian's manifestation, Helmasuin the scientist. The only thing he left out was about the gray fog and the parts about the great existence above the gray fog. Finally, he mentioned something. Does Mr. Hilarian's warning imply that I'll suffer mortal danger from the Rose School of Thought? After he folded the letter and blew the copper whistle to summon the messenger, Klein still didn't find it safe enough. He hurriedly took out the adventurer's harmonica and blew into it. Silently, Rionette Tinker appeared before him. Each of the 4 heads with blonde hair and red eyes rotated and said, "There's no letter. I have something to discuss with you." Klein forced a big smile. He handed over the gold coin he received from Anderson and said, "This is the fee for the summoning." One of the heads, Rionette Tinker, held bit onto the gold coin. The 2 other heads that didn't get the chance to speak asked, "What is it? I might face a certain degree of danger soon. I wonder if it's possible to summon you for help." Klein tried his best to make his eyes look sincere. The 8 eyes on Rionette Tinker's forehead darted around as they said, "Yes, pay 10,000 gold coins." 10,000 gold coins. That's 10,000 pounds. Klein turned to gape as he said with a wry smile, "I don't have that much money." Rionette Tinker's 4 heads spoke one after another. "You can pay by installments." Klein was surprised that his messenger kept with the times. After 2 seconds of shock, he said, "All right." Rionette Tinker didn't say anything else as her 4 heads nodded simultaneously before disappearing in front of Klein and returning to the spirit world. Chapter 725. Morning. Upon seeing the messenger disappear, Klein thought of the demigods he could contact on short notice, but he realized that there weren't any. All he could do was turn his attention onto what he should do next. The citywide broadcast must have made Sea King John Cotman not only find Helmasuin, but he would also do his best to search for Sea God and the traces of his believers. It's easy to be detected if I leave in the middle of the night, so I can only choose to stay here until daybreak. I can't take that ship tomorrow. If I encounter an attack midway, I might affect everyone on the ship. Furthermore, it's not discreet enough. I can summon an undersea creature and leave by riding it. I can rest and switch rides on the deserted islands and reefs we encounter along the way until I arrive at the next port. Since Orange Light said that the unique trait can only be detected at close distances, it still won't exceed the size of a city, even if the Mother Tree of Desire tries to expand her perception range to find me via a ritual or her believers. It might even be limited to the size of a particular street. This is also why I encountered a trap when I arrived in Oravi. As long as I leave Byam, I should be able to escape from their gaze. While Klein's thoughts gradually turned clear, he suddenly heard a signal from the radio transceiver. He hurriedly went over and quickly jotted it down. Then, with the codebook, he transcribed the corresponding words into a single sentence. Before long, the telegram's content appeared on paper in jet black. "I see you. I see you." When Klein read those words, he felt a chill run through his heart. Byam, in an ordinary residence not far from the Governor General's office. In a spacious basement, there were candles silently burning, scattering their dim glow around the surroundings. Silver coin Viper Odor had already taken off his hooded robe. He looked at the middle-aged man opposite him as he trembled. He said with a quivering voice, "Lord Senor, I don't know how Helmasuin's real hiding place was known by others as well." Senor wore an old triangular hat. His eye sockets were recessed, and his face was shockingly pale. He looked more like an evil spirit than a human. He raised his hand to stroke the 2 black mustaches above his lips as his light brown eyes coldly swept across Odor's face. In response, the well-known adventurer couldn't help but lower his head. After observing him for a few seconds, Admiral of Blood, in his white trousers and red coat, said with a deep voice, "Less than 3 minutes after that telegram was sent, it was spread across the entire city. And the message spread was part of the telegram. I suspect that another faction has begun paying notice to radio transmissions, and they had obtained our codebook from Old Quinn." "It has to be the case." Odor hurriedly echoed, hoping that Admiral of Blood wouldn't pin the loss of Helmasuin as him being inept. He knew very well that this pirate admiral was cruel to subordinates who made mistakes. Senor swept his gaze at Oder and sneered. Regardless, you failed. If not for you and your mistress giving me plenty of joy, I would have gotten you to dig out your intestines. Send a telegram. Tell that listener who might or might not exist that I can see him. Let him spend the night in horror and unease. This is the only thing you need to do now. Upon hearing that, Oder immediately heaved a sigh of relief. He glanced at Admiral of Blood in trepidation and the bloody altar behind him before reverently replying, "Yes, Lord Senor." He felt that he would have become part of the sacrificial items just moments ago. After Oder retreated out of the basement, Senor turned his head to look at the altar covered with human heads, organs, limbs, and blood. He said in a manner even more reverent than how Oder treated him, "Lord Shanks, has the ritual succeeded?" "Yes. All that's left is to wait for God to respond." A cold, unfeeling voice sounded from the drooping curtains around the altar. Then, the curtains seemed to possess life as they rolled up on both sides, smoothly forming a knot before landing in the middle of the altar. A somewhat translucent figure appeared by the side of the altar at some point in time. His skin was slightly brown, and his wrinkles formed deep crevices. His white, thinned hair was like leaves in autumn, as though they had lived for many, many years. He humbly fixated his gaze at the candlelight with his brown eyes. Senor didn't dare say a word as he stood beside Lord Shanks, awaiting for any changes to happen to the altar. Suddenly, the candle's flame was dyed with all kinds of colors. Each color seemed to correspond to the different desires of an observer. The heads, organs, limbs, and blood on the altar moved by themselves as they stacked up together, forming the state of a melted candle. Before long, they formed a tree of flesh and blood that wasn't too tall. Its surface was uneven, resembling the shell of a walnut. Plop, plop, plop. The interior of the tree of flesh and blood seemed to have a heart beating forcefully with strength. When Senor was about to succumb to the din, the tree of flesh and blood instantly withered, rotting into slosh and collapsing. There was a tiny, flesh-colored, moist, sticky ball left behind. Soon, the tiny ball grew 4 limbs and a head, turning into a palm-sized humanoid creature. Its face didn't have any eyes, nose, or ears, other than a pinhole-like mouth. In its mouth, grayish-white fog spewed out before converging back in. It repeated several times without stopping. The elder named Shanks devoutly and passionately chanted the name, Mother Tree of Desire, and reached out to grab the strange tiny figure. Silently, all the candlelights were extinguished, but to a wraith who had night vision, this didn't affect them from seeing things. Senor observed Shanks and heard this important person say in a deep voice, "We've prepared for a long time for this ritual, and God's grace can help us sense the existence of the target through a wider range. Next, we can use the glasses made by the Life School of Thought to accurately locate him." As he spoke, Shanks took out a monocle from his inner pocket. It didn't look any different from a normal monocle, but it coruscated with a pearly white luster in the darkness. "Lord Shanks, what should we do next?" Senor asked respectfully. The wrinkled Shanks thought for a few seconds and said, "Seek out the target after daybreak. If he has powerful helpers, we will monitor him and prevent him from leaving our detection range. Then, patiently await Lord Sua's arrival. If he doesn't have any guardians and is weak himself, then we shall take action directly." After hearing the word Sua, the corners of Senor's forehead twitched as though just the mere mention of this important figure's left him apprehensive. He slowly took a deep breath and said, "Yes, Lord Shanks." After answering, Senor instinctively touched the necklace by his chest. The necklace seemed to be made of pure silver, and the pendant looked like an ancient coin. Klein, who didn't get much sleep for the rest of the night due to the fright from receiving the telegram, immediately sacrificed his suitcase, wallet, and most of his cash to the mysterious space above the gray fog at daybreak. After clearing up his tracks, he went to the front desk to check out. He rode a carriage to the borders of Byam, left the city, and climbed the mountain as though he was heading for a cemetery prepared for locals. Midway through his journey, he suddenly took a detour into the woods and planned on walking straight to the cliffs where a massive undersea creature was waiting underneath for him. The birds chirped and the insects buzzed in the woods as critters would occasionally scuttle by. Klein walked through the humic material-covered grounds at high speed. Along the way, he saw mushrooms growing after the rain, torn cloth, and rubbish which the biome residences had left behind after a picnic. Everything seemed so serene alongside the fresh morning air. A leaf fluttered down as Klein didn't stop and easily dodged it. At that moment, the leaf's speed sped up and did a surprising bend, clinging to him in between his lips and nose. It was like an adult's palm that clasped his mouth and nose tightly, making it impossible for him to breathe. So. The surrounding trees had their branches fall off as they shot at Klein like sharp arrows. And the rubbish left from the picnic received a life of their own. They formed an airtight net as they came looming over. Chapter 726. Preparations are very important. Suddenly, Klein had a familiar feeling. It felt like every tree, every leaf, every rock, every blade of grass wanted him dead. Upon seeing the rubbish comprising of fragments and paper lunge at him in a strange web, his body suddenly collapsed into a paper figurine. The arrow-like branches impaled the paper figurines and landed into the distance. As for the strange net, it immediately enveloped everything within into a ball as it gently squirmed. Klein's body appeared to the side about 8 meters away. He knew that the attack he was worried about had finally descended upon him. He didn't make any observations or show any hesitation. Raising his right palm, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the adventurer's harmonica. The situation he had encountered had made him realize that the attacker was likely a demigod from the Rose school of thought. It was an enemy he was currently unable to defend against. The one who had been pursuing Sharon back then gave him a similar feeling. At this moment, the paper figurines in his pocket suddenly flew out as they plastered over his face, one after another, layer after layer. At the same time, Klein's sleeves automatically tightened as they bound both his arms, preventing his palms from reaching down. His Taraba shirt and brown jacket were tightening like a bear giving him a hug. In seconds, he was bound on the spot by his clothes, trousers, and shoes. His face was covered with paper figurines, as his ribs were on the brink of fracturing. He found it abnormally difficult to breathe. Klein was mentally prepared and was equipped with rich combat experience, so he didn't panic. His right thumb and middle finger, which weren't affected, touched each other as he snapped his fingers. At his ham, scarlet flames immediately soared up, burning the tightly bound trousers clean before spreading upwards and downwards. Seizing this opportunity, Klein bent his knees and jumped up with great difficulty, like a cannonball that weakly fell to the ground moments after being launched, as he lunged to his right. In midair, he snapped his fingers again. This time, the sleeve by the right arm joint was ignited. As for the spot where he was originally standing, the green weeds suddenly withered as the blackened ground suddenly turned white as if it had been weathered by the elements. This attack was silent and deadly, without any forewarning. Klein knew that his enemy was powerful and that staying in the same spot would likely result in him suffering an attack he couldn't resist. Therefore, he first removed the influence on his legs. If he hadn't done so, he would have already been heavily injured and lose his ability to do combat. He might have even perished. With a smacking sound, 2 spots around Klein's sleeves ignited. His right palm finally had the freedom to move as he reached into his pocket and grabbed the adventurer's harmonica. Plop! He fell to the ground, rolling as he immediately stopped himself with his right hand to bounce up. His left palm, which wore a human-skinned glove, snapped its fingers. This time, his target was the paper figurines that were plastered over his face to prevent him from breathing. The paper figurines burned up as the scarlet tongues of fire burned Klein's hair. At that moment, a scene suddenly flashed in his mind. An icicle had formed and was speeding right for his head like a thin, gloomy green arrow. Due to its speed, it was translucent itself, making it usually impossible to discover it. But even though Klein's danger premonition was triggered, it was a little too late. This was because his clothes were still affecting his mobility. It was too late for him to dodge the attack. A thought flashed through his mind as he barely bent his back, his upper torso was bent backward, and he moved quite significantly to his right. The thin, cold ice arrow struck his left chest, instantly shattering the brown jacket and white round collar shirt which were located there as they scattered into the air. However, this lethal ice arrow didn't continue heading forward. This was because in its way was a book with a dark brown cover. The book appeared ordinary, and it was bound into a book with commonly seen yellowish-brown goatskin, but it didn't shatter like the two pieces of clothing. There wasn't even a hole pricked open. Grozel's Travels. This was an item that even the sea god Scepter's lightning storm imbued with some powers of the mysterious space had failed to damage. Last night, the telegram of "I see you" gave Klein such a fright that he undoubtedly reinforced his protective countermeasures. He prepared every method he could think of. Apart from hiding the book at his vital spot, his other pocket had the iron cigar case which stored the influence of the corrupted true creator. Once things went bad, he would dispel the wall of spirituality, throw out the item, and see if it would draw the attention of the true creator. He hoped that he would send his powerful subordinates to make the situation more chaotic. He knew that even evil gods like the true creator hated the mother tree of desire. After withstanding the ice arrow, Klein fell to the ground while somersaulting to the side. He then brought the adventurer's harmonica to his lips and blew hard into it. At that moment, his face was turning a little black due to the burning of the paper figurines, but due to flame controlling, he wasn't injured. Then he felt that the clothes on his left arm, waist, thighs, neck, and legs were restored to normal, giving him newfound freedom. At the moment he blew the harmonica, he quickly activated his spirit vision. He saw Miss Messenger walk out of the void with 4 blonde, red-eyed heads in hand. They automatically turned and stared at the same spot. One of the heads grunted as it opened its mouth and began drawing in air. A cold wind hummed as a figure was forcibly pulled out from a green tree 100 meters away from Klein. This figure failed to maintain his difficult-to-detect state as he rapidly turned half-transparent and half-corporeal. He was the wrinkled elder with white, thin hair. His facial features had the traits of the people of the southern continent. Just as his brown eyes reflected Rionette Tinker, his brows pricked up. Then, he didn't hesitate to open his mouth as though he was about to deliver an extreme curse that he had been preparing for a long time. At this moment, another one of the heads which Rionette Tinker was holding had opened its mouth as well, as though it was making a silent screech. With that, nothing happened inside the forest. When Shanks saw this, he hurriedly turned his head to look at Klein, who had yet to react in time when a figure with white, thin hair and exaggerated wrinkles appeared in his eyes. His mind instantly turned cold. Although his thoughts weren't impeded, he had lost control over his body. All he could do was watch the white-haired elder vanish as he turned to face Miss Messenger. The 2 heads which Rionette Tinker carried suddenly flew out and appeared before Klein. One of them opened its mouth as it drew in air, while the other's red eyes turned dark as its teeth turned long and sharp, phasing between an incorporeal and corporeal state. Klein saw the translucent elder with white, thin hair being forcefully pulled out from his body before Miss Messenger's head with the long teeth that bit at his shoulder, tearing out an object that appeared both like a spirit body and a physical body. Shanks frowned without screaming. Its figure abruptly vanished as it leaped to a spot with a glass fragment 100 meters away. Following that, he seemed to be pursued by formless hands and enemies. He kept phasing into shallow puddles of water, the eyes of animals, the dew on plants, etc. Finally, he was able to catch a breather, and still, Klein was feeling a little stiff and cold from the inside out. Phew. Shanks entered the spirit world and walked out again. In his hand was a moist, sticky, palm-sized doll. This figure's face only had a hole as it was inhaling and exhaling a grayish-white fog which Klein found familiar. Shanks didn't hesitate as he stuffed the doll into his mouth. Upon seeing this, Rionette Tinker's other 2 heads left her palm, and like before, flew towards Shanks at a fast speed, arriving nearly instantly. However, Shanks had already begun transforming. His body turned black as his skin scrunched up and water began seeping out. His hair, brows, and other parts began withering and dropping. Following that, his limbs grew long and thin. In just a second, Shanks seemed to be assimilated by the doll, becoming a huge, black, moist infant with long 4 limbs and swollen, shriveled skin. His eyes, nose, mouth, and ears moved from their original locations to the middle of his face as though they were gathering together to form a brand new organ. His skin, limbs, and newly formed organ brought an indescribable sense of mystery and wickedness. Just a single look had made his body, which had just recovered from the coldness, feel extremely itchy. Red spots protruded from his skin as a result of the clumps of fine granules. His eyes undoubtedly suffered a piercing pain. He instinctively closed them tight as tears were forced out. By the time he calmed himself with cogitation and opened his eyes again, he realized that Miss Messenger and the Rose School of Thought's demigod had vanished. However, Klein's spiritual intuition told him that they were nearby. They were in an intense battle shuttling between the real world and the spirit world. Be it the dropping of the leaves, the shaking of the weeds, the crawling of the worms, and the fleeing of the wild beasts, all of them represented each and every clash. As his mind whirred, Klein took out Death Knell and tapped his left thumb on the first segment of his index finger twice. Countless illusory thin threads appeared in his eyes, making him see objects that usually couldn't be seen with his normal vision or spirit vision. 2 blobs were flying around him, and the dense black bundles of threads that entangled with each other were Rionette Tyneker and the Rose School of Thought's demigod. Apart from these, Klein also discovered that a blob of illusory black threads was rapidly approaching him. It would stop from time to time, so as to avoid the intense battle between the 2 demigods. There's another enemy? An enemy who was hiding in the distance awaiting the results, but hasn't decided to participate in the battle? Anyways, anyone who's stealthily approaching in such a situation must be an enemy. Klein's eyes moved slightly as he cocked the death knell and lowered it naturally to put it into a state for lethal attack. Then, he pretended as though he hadn't detected the bundle of illusory black threads, stuffed his left palm into his pocket, and grabbed a gold coin. He made it tumble between his fingers as though he was in a divination state. He was doing this to disrupt the approacher's spiritual intuition for danger. After losing his paper figurines, this was the only method he had. After patiently waiting for 2 seconds, when the other party was within shooting range, Klein's eyes turned solemn as he suddenly raised his right hand, aimed, and pulled the trigger. Chapter 727. Lucky One Thud. The black revolver with the slightly long barrel recoiled backward as a pale golden beam shot out, heading straight for the spot where the target was about to arrive at. However, the illusory black threads suddenly stopped as though they were observing something. From his condition, it didn't appear like he had sensed the arrival of danger, but he had his attention attracted by something else. A grayish-white rabbit leaped out the thick grass and fled far away as the tree standing in front of the blob of illusory black threads collapsed due to the gunshot. At the height of a human, a gigantic and irregular hole and a raging pure fire appeared at the tree's trunk, directly splitting it from the middle. Death Knell's might was equivalent to a small-caliber cannon, and its penetrating powers were even more potent. The blob of dense, illusory black threads was clearly given a fright as it instinctively disappeared from where it was, appearing on the surface of a nearby puddle of water. Inevitably, his figure was outlined. He had a pale face with deep recessed eye sockets and light brown eyes. He looked to be in his 40s, had a double mustache above his lips, and wore an old triangular hat. Klein was no stranger to the man, as his bounty notice often appeared before his eyes. Step by step, they were stacked into a clear image, Admiral of Blood Seigneur. Just in loan alone, his bounty was worth 42,000 pounds. He had long infiltrated by him. Was it to take away Turani von Helmesuen? After this scientist passed away due to being discovered, he joined the Rose School of Thought's mission to target me? I seem to have an additional weakness, but before it's triggered, I've no way of knowing what it is. As his thoughts raced, Klein saw Seigneur's figure disappear once again. However, the traces of Admiral of Blood's existence was rather obvious. The blob of illusory black threads of his was like a firefly in the darkness. It wasn't difficult to identify him at all. The blob of illusory black threads circled around him with the aid of the morning dew, glass fragments, and water puddles that had frozen for some reason. Jumping again and again from one medium to the other, the gap between the two soon narrowed. Klein didn't wait on the spot. Instead, he quickly moved but only slightly shifted his position so as to prevent the Rose School of Thought demigod, who was engaged in an intense battle, from attacking him in passing. Senyor's performance made him understand one thing. A wraith's ability to possess someone to directly control their body requires them to enter a certain range. Previously, although the Rose School of Thought demigod was able to accomplish it at further distances, he hadn't done so, perhaps out of contempt or for fear of any accidents. It could be confirmed that Senor was a Sequence 5 wraith. Klein kept changing his location, and he awaited the opportunity when the distance between them was more suitable. Just as Admiral of Blood's speed slowed down slightly, and he was about to possess his target from a distance, Klein's left glove suddenly turned deep black, as though it was formed layer by pure particles. Following that, he said a word filled with foulness, a word that came from the devil language: slow. Senor had sensed it and changed his position before Klein could even open his mouth. But everything within an 8-meter radius came to a halt. His evasive maneuver had failed to show any effects. It was an area of effect attack. Senor's figure suddenly became slow. He once again outlined his figure in the real world as Klein raised his iron-black revolver, cocked it, and placed his target in his sights. With death now, he saw that Senor's body was covered with all kinds of colors that indicated his weakness wasn't at his head, but slightly above his throat. Without any hesitation or delay, Klein pulled the trigger. Lethal attack. At that moment, a blob of illusory black threads walked to Senor's side and pulled at him. Admiral of Blood immediately moved diagonally as the golden bullet grazed past his neck, striking a boulder and shattering it. A golden flame burst from Senor's neck as it jerked his head up and opened his mouth. A sharp shriek blasted out and entered Klein's ears, causing his mind to hum as his body came to a temporary halt. Formless souls had flown to Senor's side at some point in time before mixing with cold winds. From the sky and from the ground, they surged towards the enemy. In each of Klein's eyes, a pale-looking man with a red coat and triangular hat quickly appeared and took form. Klein snapped his fingers as his body was instantly enveloped by scarlet flames. He disappeared from his location before the wraith was able to possess him. And under a tree that was less than 10 meters away, weeds burst into flames as the flames grew bigger and they soared into the sky. Klein nimbly leaped out from it and raised death knell again. He aimed towards the spot where he was originally standing still at, and he injected more than twice the normal amount of spirituality into the gun. Slaughter! He pulled the trigger as a golden bullet split into countless shrapnel and, with a sacred flame, swept to the region the gun's mouth had aimed at. The formless specters and souls seemed to be swept away by a solar hurricane as they failed to resist and were ignited amidst screaming. Senor knew that a counterattack was in place once his possession attempt didn't succeed. He immediately flashed into a nearby glass fragment in an attempt to evade the incoming shot, but the bullet hurricane brought about by Slaughter was a rather huge range that included that glass fragment. Amidst a huge boom, golden flames struck the sides of the glass without hitting it. With only burn injuries, Senor leaped to another mirror surface and appeared on the surface of a rolling drop of dew a distance away. His body had a rotting wound thanks to the purification powers, but it wasn't anything serious. There's no way he's that lucky, right? Indeed, Senor has a mystical item that makes himself lucky. There are only 3 purifying bullets left. Klein frowned as he agilely ran over as though he was in pursuit. As he knew that he was facing members of the Rose School of Thought, he had changed all the Beyonder bullets in his revolver to purifying bullets that targeted wraiths and zombies. There were a total of 6 bullets, and now he had already shot thrice. In the first shot, Senor was saved by a rabbit that suddenly leaped out. In the second shot, he was yanked away by the Rose School of Thought's demigod who happened to come beside him. In the third shot, he happened to be in the gap of the fragment amidst the Slaughter hurricane, preventing him from suffering too much damage. Klein found this level of luck completely unacceptable. However, Klein didn't wallow in depression. Instead, he turned back into Gehrman Sparrow's appearance and build. This was for him to immediately throw a bunch of Sea God domain charms to create a certain commotion once things went south, so as to attract the attention of Sea King John Cotman, who was in Biome City. If this sequence 3 demigod were to arrive, he would be facing a Rose School of Thought demigod, a hostile pirate admiral, and an adventurer with a mysterious background who had certain ties with the military. It was quite obvious who he would deal with first. As for Miss Messenger, Klein believed that she could escape into the spirit world in a timely fashion and was free to choose whether to participate in the battle royale or leave. The reason why Klein didn't escape in the middle of the night after receiving the telegram last night was because Sea King gave him a sense of security. If he were to leave alone, he would definitely be noticed and captured by the Church of Storms. He would be interrogated, making the subsequent developments unpredictable. If he were to stay in his room and await the person who saw him to attack, he had a chance of struggling until he reached the streets, allowing Sea King to notice it. Faced with an evil operative who was at least a demigod and a Sequence 5 adventurer who was rumored to have ties with the military, there was no doubt that John Cotman would first deal with the Rose School of Thought member. And as a cardinal of the Church of Storms and a high-ranking deacon of the mandated Punishers, he could use various sealed artifacts of the diocese. He could last a moment, even if he faced an angel. At the same time, with the reinforcements from the military, there was a chance for Klein to escape to the sea during the chaos and leave via whale. To his regret, the night remained peaceful after he received the telegram. And once daybreak happened, Sea King would find it difficult to monitor the entire city. But Klein snapped his fingers again, igniting the surrounding trees. This appeared like blooming fireworks around him as they exuded an inexplicable sense of beauty. The reason why he had chosen to pass through the forest to head for the cliff was because this was a place that was suitable for a magician's performance. His figure flashed through the flames as he circled around Senor, avoiding his approach and control. And from the previous experiences and lessons, Senor knew that his target had an area of effect attack and a damaging blow. He didn't dare stay too close to him, and he would pull away and create a gap once he missed an attack. Otherwise, he would use a Wraith's Shriek to affect his target or use his pale green fingers to aim at his target. Unfortunately, the latter could only extinguish flames and wither vegetation. There was no way to pinpoint Klein's location. Seeing how the fireworks-like flames were the biggest barrier to his attacks, Senor stopped and let out the deafening shriek which would also damage a spirit body. Amidst the shriek, the icy blue halo beneath his feet rapidly expanded, covering the mud, randomly strewn weeds, and scattered rocks with a layer of ice. The flames sizzled as they produced tiny amounts of mist before being extinguished by the frost. Klein was influenced by the Wraith's Shriek, causing his flaming jump to be one step too slow. He ended up failing. His figure projected itself midway as his feet stumbled. Then, he saw illusory skulls swirling with black gas rush at him, bringing with them the strong smell of death, as though an envoy from the underworld had arrived. At that instant, Klein didn't seem like he could dodge. However, a light blue fireball emanating the smell of sulfur suddenly condensed before him. His glove remained black as it remained in its devil state. With a thumping sound, the fireball was extinguished as the illusory skulls shattered and scattered to the ground, creating spots that didn't have any life to them. Right on the heels of that, Klein steadied his body and took out the iron cigar case from his pocket. He threw it at Admiral of Blood Senor as his glove turned noble and sinister at some point in time. Baron of Corruption, Bribe. Chapter 728. Triple Combo. Senor obviously wasn't going to bet that the item thrown by his opponent didn't pose a threat. He immediately dodged far away, allowing the iron cigar case which was sealed by a wall of spirituality to fall to the ground. Then, he opened his mouth once again and produced a shriek. A roar that seemed to come from the depths of his own spirit body made Klein experience excruciating pain in his head. Even though he often suffered from the ravings of existences like the True Creator and Mr. Door, and was rather resistant towards such attacks, it was impossible for him to not pause momentarily. He felt his nose burning as though a capillary had burst. However, with his resistance combined together with bribe, the effects were reduced. It made his momentary pause only last for an instant, and this was something Senor had no idea of knowing. Therefore, Klein pretended as though he hadn't recovered as he revealed his weak state, waiting for the enemy to fall into his trap. In an ordinary battle, as a wraith was able to jump through mirror-like mediums, making it impossible to determine that location ahead of time, it made it impossible to maintain a 5-meter distance from his opponent, even if he created flames and repeatedly used it to achieve phasing. It caused his spirit body thread's controlling ability to be disrupted momentarily after there were any significant effects. For this, he planned on taking a little risk. He made his opponent fall for a trap he planned, so as to quickly end the battle and escape to the cliff. Seeing his target appear dazed due to the repeated shrieks, Senor didn't hesitate to make his aura turn deep. Admiral of Blood's contracted figure rapidly appeared in Klein's eyes in an abnormally clear manner. This wasn't a reflection of the world, but 2 tiny figures seemingly coming to life in his eyes. When the wraith's possession was almost close to completion, Klein, with his tattered and charred clothes, unhurriedly extended his left palm as though he was gesturing, "Please," as a polite gentleman. Creeping hunger maintained its sinister and noble blackness as it forcefully distorted Admiral of Blood's target. Due to the freezing halo from before, there was frost and crystalline bodies everywhere around them. All of them were equivalent to a mirror surface. On the thin ice, Senor with his triangular hat had appeared there. His expression was as though he was at a loss. At that moment, creeping hunger switched to a deep black state as Klein said a word filled with foulness, a word that came from the devil language, slow. Just as he was about to use the mirror surfaces to phase away, Senor instantly froze. His figure involuntarily outlined itself as his body turned extremely rigid. His attempts had failed. As there was no way to repeatedly use slow, Klein made his left glove turn pale as it was tinged with a slightly dark green color. Zombie! The ceiling caused by the frost on the ground had once again exacerbated as they rapidly spread to Senor's side as they began to spread from his toes to turn him into a completed ice sculpture. With his knowledge that wraiths had a very strong resistance to the cold, Klein didn't let his guard down or waste any time. He made creeping hunger transform as if it was gilded. The illusory black threads in his eyes were hidden away as 2 blinding silver bolts of lightning shot out from the innermost depths of his eyes. Interrogator's psychic piercing. In his usual state, Senor's fusion of spirit and flesh typically wouldn't be significantly affected. He could even cause the attack to backfire on his opponent. However, having just recovered from slow, he found himself sealed in ice. All he could do was resist the formless bolt that targeted his spirit body. His mind felt as though a blade had penetrated it as it twisted. The pain spread through his body as he temporarily lost all reason. By the time he regained his lucidity and prepared to make continuous leaps to open up a distance, the cold adventurer opposite him opened his mouth once again. Slow. Does it? Senor's actions turned sluggish and impeded once again. Then, without any surprises, he suffered from the 2 follow-up attacks of ice stun and psychic piercing. When he barely escaped again, the black-haired, brown-eyed Gehrman Sparrow opened his mouth a 3rd time with a deadpan expression. Slow. Senor was enraged as he reeled in despair before finding himself stuck in a perpetual cycle. As for Klein, who had kept his opponent in place 3 times, was beginning to control his opponent's spirit body threads. In fact, the most effective solution for when his opponent was unable to escape was to take the opportunity to use Death Knell to deliver 2 or 3 lethal attacks. But his past failures had told him that his enemy had a mystical item that allowed him to be lucky. An overly direct and lethal shot might very well lead to an accident, resulting in some undesirable effects. It was precisely because of this that he decided to gradually proceed in the proper order by controlling Admiral of Blood's spirit body threads. Time quickly passed. As Klein ran around Senor to dodge the possible attacks from the Rose School of Thought demigod, he controlled Senor's spirit body threads, and he slowly reached the state of gaining initial control. 3 seconds. 2 seconds. 1 second. Senor's thoughts instantly turned sluggish as though every part of his body was rusting. Klein no longer had the strength to use creeping hunger again. He continued deepening his control as he began walking at an adequate speed. I can't see this continue. Thoughts slowly moved through Senor's mind as a translucent icicle condensed in front of him. It was dyed with a gloomy green as though it was showing its respect to the surrounding forest. As for Klein, who had witnessed his opponent's series of slow actions, he unhurriedly retracted his left hand and took out Grozel's travels from his chest and braced himself. So, the icicle finally shot out, seemingly heading for Klein's chest, but it suddenly changed directions midway as it flew diagonally upwards. This adjustment should have been a sudden lethal blow, but as Señor's thoughts had been slowed down significantly, the order received by the icicle had only happened when it was almost reaching Klein. This made the sudden change insufficient to catch Klein by surprise as he shifted Grozel's travels and easily blocked the attack. Señor's expression turned pale again. After a few seconds of thought, he slowly opened his mouth in an attempt to let out a wraith's shriek. Having already prepared himself, Klein spoke first. Bang! An air bullet quickly shot out and struck Señor in the mouth, throwing his head backward as teeth fell. The shriek was left stuck in his throat. Seeing the control deepen and how Señor's resistance was crumbling bit by bit, to the point of losing his reason and launching a barrage of attacks like a lunatic, Klein suddenly felt some joy. At that moment, a shrill, sharp infant's cry sounded and resounded in the woods. Lumps protruded all over Klein's body as he dropped Grozel's travels from his hand. His head felt as though it was being clasped tightly by an invisible hand, making him momentarily lose his senses of his surroundings, including the spirit-body threads. His control over Señor was removed as a result. About 100 meters away from them, the large-sized baby, which was black, swollen, and wrinkled, that appeared to have stormed out of the water had escaped its illusory state and returned to reality. His limbs were long and thin, and there was only an irregular hole on his face. Circling the hole were gnarling teeth. At that moment, Shank's body had an additional wound that was obvious and deep. It was a piercing wound that went through the black and swollen skin, causing putrid blackish-green liquid to gush out. After this Rose School of Thought's demigod appeared, he stopped dodging or escaping. He began screaming like crazy, letting out infantile screams. It made Klein and Señor fall into a painful stupor. Even their bodies showed signs of losing control. The four blonde, red-eyed heads were thrown into the void as they opened their mouths and let out a soundless shriek, silencing the terrifying cries. Rionette Tinker and Shanks had engaged in another round of combat, phasing between the spirit world and reality from time to time as they shuttled between leaves, weeds, insect eggs, ice crystals, and thorns. Señor and Klein stood in their spots in a stupor. They tried their best to recover from the effects of the infantile cry. In this aspect, Señor believed that, as a wraith, he had an unsurpassable advantage. The corners of his lips subconsciously curled up a little. He had already figured out what to do with his opponent later. But at that moment, the eyes of the adventurer who was in tattered clothes while exuding a cold demeanor had turned lucid. It had only been a second since the infantile cry had ended. Klein, who was experienced in this, quickly recovered as he realized that Señor was still in a dazed and impeded state. An opportunity! His mind stirred, but he didn't attempt a long-distance attack which allowed for plenty of accidents. Instead, he chose to control Señor's spirit-body threads, which took more time. He tapped his right foot as his figure dashed towards his opponent like a panther. His left glove was dark, and when it moved backward, it condensed in a manner that resembled a blade, forming a gigantic weapon formed from lava and flames. Desire Apostle, Sword of Lava. Bam! Klein's body passed by Señor's left as the searing sword swept across his chest and got stuck in the middle. The light blue flames ignited Señor, but aside from suffering damage to his body, he didn't lose his life. However, the pain left him yelling incessantly. After the two brushed by each other, Klein immediately abandoned the Sword of Lava. He took a step to his left and turned around, facing Admiral of Blood's back. He raised the iron-black death knell to his opponent's head. He didn't use lethal attack, and he directly pulled the trigger. With a bang, his body suddenly shook a little. This was because the spot he had stepped onto appeared to be a hole. Hence, Death Knell had slid downwards, and the golden bullet had hit the side of Señor's neck. Blood tainted with a dark green tinge spewed out. Admiral of Blood had lost nearly half his neck as he fell forward. He fainted, but he remained alive. Klein was just about to add another shot when the sky suddenly darkened. An arm suddenly reached out. The arm was 10 meters long, and it had a black sticky surface with strange protrusions. They were either skulls, erected eyeballs, or barbed tongues. The moment it appeared, it made the entire forest shake. All the leaves withered as all the insects stiffened to their deaths. All the beasts either fell paralyzed to the ground, or they began biting themselves wildly, leaving their bodies bleeding. Klein's danger premonition reached its limit. He hurriedly closed his eyes, lunged forward, and did a roll. He grabbed Grozel's travels and held it in front of his face. Chapter 729. Chaos. The entire forest was withering as though an entity that was bringing about destruction to everything was about to descend. Just as the arm was about to fully extend, a thick bolt of silver lightning smote down from nowhere, illuminating the entire mountain. The sizzling sounds chained together as a cage only spoken in myths enclosed around the black sticky arm. Dark clouds quickly converged together in the sky, forming brows and a mouth, as though a face was hidden within. In Biome City, the huge commotion was noticed by Sea King John Cotman. He didn't hesitate to take action as he ordered the mandated punishers to activate the corresponding sealed artifacts. Rionette Tinker's figure was forced out of the void, but her complicated black dress didn't seem crumpled at all. She raised her left hand as two of the blonde, red-eyed heads flew back and landed on her severed neck. The remaining two continued engaging in combat with the black, swollen, and wrinkled infant. When the cut at her neck began to wriggle, two corresponding cuts were connected. Her figure instantly burgeoned to the size of a Gothic castle. Patterns, vines, and accessories appeared on the surface, interweaving into a mysterious, sinister sight that couldn't be looked at. Klein closed his eyes tight as he placed Grozel's travels in front of his face, injecting his spirituality into it, but he was unable to eliminate all the effects inflicted upon him. His body kept quivering as granules kept protruding from his body. And only at this moment did he confirm that the side effect of using Death Knell was a fear of the dark. For the next 6 hours, he wouldn't suffer any more weaknesses. Thankfully, the weakness is just insurmountable, but it doesn't mean that I'm unable to resist for a short period of time. Klein desperately closed his eyes as tears kept rolling down his cheeks. He didn't spend time considering the problems regarding this, because the situation had developed into one of extreme danger, but it was also very chaotic. The one that descended seems to be stronger than Sea King. It's likely an angel, but his condition doesn't seem to be particularly good as well. He didn't directly appear, and he instead used the spirit world to attack. Is it because he can't rush here in time and could only consider using this method? Thankfully, I received a warning from Orange Light. Otherwise, the results would be unthinkable if this situation drags on. As Klein's thoughts flashed through his mind, his first reaction was to take the opportunity to flee and open up a safe distance. However, he knew that hastily retreating without any preparations was equally dangerous. If the Rose School of Thought's angel abandons the attack and retracts his arm, Sea King John Cotman wouldn't have any motivation in embroiling himself in a pursuit effort. This is because he isn't facing a saint who he can consider retaining. This way, simply relying on Miss Messenger, Rionette Tinker, makes it difficult to stop this entity. I might be pursued again when the time comes. I have to add more trouble for him, making him temporarily unable to leave. I'll take this opportunity to escape the waters where Blue Mountain Island is. As his thoughts churned, Klein followed his emergency plans, took out Grozel's travels, stuffed Death Knell inside, and made a few rolls before arriving next to the iron cigar case. He stabbed it with his finger, removing the wall of spirituality and opening the case, and he threw tinder, which was corrupted by the true creator, into the air, towards the source of the danger. Right on the heels of that, Klein used Grozel's travels to shield the top of his head, opened his eyes, and took out a whistle. This wasn't Azek's copper whistle, but the numinous episcopate copper whistle which he had obtained from a mysticism enthusiast in Backland. It originated from a resurrected numinous episcopate member. Back then, Klein had made a divination about the copper whistle, and he received a revelation that sending a message would be extremely dangerous. At that moment, he decided to allow extreme danger to meet extreme danger, so as to create an even more chaotic situation that benefited him. He quickly put the copper whistle to his mouth and blew into it. Then, he activated his spirit vision without daring to look up. A skull with 3 lifeless eyes emerged. Around it were black appendage-like tentacles. Without any hesitation, Klein handed over a white feather left behind by the resurrected numinous episcopate member to the messenger. He didn't wait for the messenger to disappear as he immediately bulged his muscles, swung his arm, and threw the copper whistle into the air where the source of danger was. With that done, he put away the iron cigar case, did another roll, and bounced up as he rushed straight for the cliff. During this process, he kept his head down and kept changing location. He didn't dare to look at the scene happening above him, nor did he dare to stay any longer. When he passed by the spot where Admiral of Blood Seigneur should have been lying unconscious, Klein's gaze suddenly froze. He was alarmed to find that he had vanished. In that chaotic situation without any aid, this wraith, who had suffered immense damage and was unable to maintain his spirit-body state, had vanished. Klein paused as he swept his gaze. He saw that ahead of him were a few drops of splattered dark red blood that coruscated with a dark green tint. And this region was where Grozel's travels had previously dropped. No way. A few drops of Admiral of Blood's blood dropped onto the book's cover? This sucked him in? Klein frowned as he didn't think it was a good thing. He was afraid that the angel and saint that the Mother Tree of Desire had sent was able to gain the help of Admiral of Blood from within Grozel's travels to pursue him. However, it was impossible for him to abandon the book. Without it, Klein didn't believe that he was lucky enough to dodge all the stray blasts and unknown shrapnel which could fall from the sky at any moment. I'll resolve this latent risk by entering with my spirit body after I escape. As a few thoughts rose up in his mind, Klein dipped the tip of his foot down as he ran, lifting up the soil which had Seigneur's blood on it, reached out and grabbed a handful. This was used to locate Admiral of Blood later. Tut, tut, tut. Klein ran in a meandering manner, holding Grozel's travels over his head, making adjustments from time to time based on his premonition for danger. The book blocked the random bolts of lightning or the scattering rain of corroding rock, and it shielded him from a terrifying gaze that was cast over. With the book, Klein successfully tore out of the lifeless forest and came to the edge of a cliff. At this moment, the surroundings turned dark. It wasn't the kind of darkness before a storm, nor was it a result of a moonless or starless night. It was a dead silence that emanated the smell of rot. Ravings sounded out from varying distances and at varying pitches, as though something seemed to be slowly breathing in the air. Klein, who was afraid of the dark, trembled. He didn't dare to look at what was happening above him. All he noticed was a few white feathers stained with yellowish oil spiraling down to the ground nearby when there was a flash of lightning. His right foot took a stride forward as he jumped off the cliff and plummeted straight down. He fell out of the darkness and could see light. Then, he dropped into a mouth that had been waiting for him for a long time. The mouth didn't have any teeth as it immediately closed and sank to the bottom of the sea. According to the agreement they had made previously, it was to head for a reef beyond Blue Mountain Island as quickly as possible. This was a gigantic undersea creature with 16 fins on its back. In the darkness, Klein instinctively wished to huddle into a ball and helplessly tremble, but he barely repressed his emotions and took out a priest of light beyonder characteristic he had prepared to deal with wraiths. He had obtained it through the glove. Pure light emanated from the translucent stone-like object as it drove away Klein's fear. He was just about to contemplate if he should wait for the outcome, or if he should attempt something, when he suddenly felt the back of his palm become itchy. He hurriedly looked down and saw his pores widen as they grew some fine white hair. These fine hair rapidly grew and looked like feathers. Klein immediately felt his entire body itch. The fellow that was attracted by the copper whistle is really very dangerous. Klein was rather experienced. He immediately stood up and took 4 steps counterclockwise while chanting the incantation in the undersea creature's mouth. His spirit body once again tore through the grayish-white which had endless ravings and roars as blackish-green gases drilled out of his body. Returning to the palace that looked like a giant's residence, Klein observed his spirit body once again, and he discovered that it had returned to normal. There weren't any of the blackish-green gases, nor were there any white feathers. Phew, it's effective. He exhaled and immediately returned to the real world. With the illumination from the priest of light beyonder characteristic, Klein saw that the white feathers on the back of his hands remained, but they had lost the ability to continue growing. There were more or less some signs in other parts of his body, but they weren't obvious. Yes, I should be able to resolve the remaining problems once Mr. Azik arrives. Klein heaved a sigh of relief and drew the crimson moon on his chest. He prayed for the goddess's blessing and that Mr. Azik would arrive quickly. At this moment, Rionette Tinker's figure appeared before him. Miss Messenger had 3 heads growing on her head while she held one in her hand. Compared to before, she appeared more lively. She reached out with her left palm and grabbed Klein's shoulder, and she directly brought him into the spirit world as they quickly traveled through it. Amidst brightly stacked colors, Klein felt somewhat dizzy before he returned to reality and realized that he was on a reef. Rionette Tinker's forehead swept the area and said, "Already safe, remember, to pay next time." With that said, she vanished as though she had something more important to do. "You could do that. I should have just gotten Miss Messenger to bring me away using such a method. However, her present state doesn't seem to be that great either. This must be a state and method she seldom uses." As Klein reflected over the matter, he placed the priest of light beyonder characteristic into his pocket, and he kept Grozel's travels outside. Just as he was about to size up his surroundings to figure out where he was, another arm reached out and grabbed his shoulder. Klein jumped in fright as he hurriedly turned his head, only to discover that Mr. Azik had arrived. Azik grabbed his shoulder and pulled him into the spirit world once again. They rapidly moved through the brightly stacked colors. "Actually, I'm already safe." The corners of Klein's mouth twitched, but he didn't say those words. Chapter 730. Handling the latent risk on a mountain outside Biome City, in a forest that had lost all its vitality because it was buried by a half-collapsed cliff. A tall, stocky middle-aged man with deep blue hair was wearing a storm priest robe as he stood in the air and overlooked the area. There was a clear burning rage in his eyes. He was none other than the Church of Storm's Cardinal, Archbishop of the Rorsted Sea, high-ranking deacon of the mandated Punishers, Sea King John Cotman. At that moment, the battle from before was still fresh in Cotman's mind. He remembered how every participant in the battle retreated. The angel from the Rose School of Thought had used a particular method to transfer his powers over from a great distance. After he failed to achieve his objectives, he rather easily brought away his heavily injured partner, and no one wanted him to stay, aside from the strange monster that appeared out of nowhere. John Cotman remembered very vividly that when the angel retracted his arm, it had sparse white feathers on the black, sticky arm. From the top of the skull and from inside the erected eye, they grew from unimaginable spots. And all of this was because the Rose School of Thought's angel was dodging the glove with the true creator's aura while using some of his strength to shatter what seemed like an ordinary copper whistle. Shortly after the sinister and strange spirit world creature engaged in battle with the angel, it voluntarily retreated into the depths of the spirit world, preventing John Cotman from pursuing it. The Aurora Order's saint who had opened a door of teleportation didn't participate in the battle. After observing the situation in puzzlement, he picked up the glove with the true creator's aura, and he opened the door to leave before the battle ended. The strange monster that was summoned because of the copper whistle didn't have a fixed form. He was like the manifestation of death itself. He was like a mist that filled the surroundings but had many feathers with yellowish marks on it. His target was obvious, the angel of the Rose School of Thought. Before the latter escaped, he had also vanished from the area as though it were in pursuit of his target. But even so, John Cotman, who had taken a sealed artifact from the city and rushed here, still felt uneasy. It felt like suddenly jumping forward while on his long journey towards death. The only person without any godhood had fled the scene before John Cotman arrived, and he was nowhere to be found. However, John Cotman recognized him. He was an adventurer who had killed a Sequence 5 Desire Apostle, making him qualified to have his information placed on Sea King's desk. Although this wasn't something that he needed to pay great attention to, John Cotman, who had experienced the seafarer sequence, still remembered the relevant information. He cast his gaze towards the cliff and looked down at the crashing waves as he muttered a name, Gehrman's Sparrow. On an island in unknown waters, Klein and Azek's figures were rapidly outlined on the shore. Klein was just about to speak when the hat-wearing, bronze-skinned Azek's eyes suddenly turned dark, as though it was connected to a silent and dark world. He grabbed the air with his right hand, and all the undeveloped white feathers flew out and curled into a bundle, landing in his palm. With a gentle squeeze, all the strange feathers vanished as though they had turned into food for the silent world in his eyes. Mr. Azek, this was brought about by that numinous episcopate whistle. Klein first pointed out the matter before explaining in detail. The situation was somewhat pressing, and to make the situation even more chaotic, I blew that copper whistle and gave that feather to the messenger. Then, a similar feeling from the underworld descended. I didn't stay, and I immediately left the area, but I still had these feathers on my body. Azek, with his soft facial features, nodded gently and said, I sensed it from afar. It shouldn't be an ordinary high-sequence beyonder. I suspect that it's a byproduct of the numinous episcopate's artificial death project. Does that so it succeeded in holding back that Rose School of Thought angel? Klein thought in joy. Azek looked around and continued, I still have matters that require my attention. This might awaken more of my memories. When all of that is done, I'll look for you again to claim that ring left behind by ancient death. I have a feeling that I might need to make a trip to the Berserk Sea or the southern continent. It's best if you head over to large cities like Backlund or Trier. In those places, the forces the Rose School of Thought can deploy are very limited. They wouldn't dare to act rashly. Of course, it's best that you choose places like Pasu Island where major churches have their headquarters, but this will bring about another type of danger. Azek's last sentence was a joke, just like an ordinary lone gentleman. The experiences of his present life seemed to leave a deep impression on him. Regardless of the portion of memories that he had recovered, he still showed clear signs of his old self. In situations regarding retained memories, the time span of decades shouldn't have much of an influence on the time span of millennia, but from a state of complete memory loss, 2 to 3 decades is enough to remold a person. After Mr. Azek completely recovers his memories, will his many different lives result in him having different personalities? What a profound question. I'll let Miss Justice consider it later and seek advice from the psychology alchemists. As Klein was thinking, he secretly heaved a sigh of relief when he realized that Mr. Azek wasn't delving into why he had a conflict with the Rose School of Thought. Instead he asked, Mr. Azek, do you know anything about the Mother Tree of Desire? Azek shook his head. I didn't even know of her existence before you sent me the letter. You didn't know the Mother Tree of Desire? Klein was taken aback as he switched to asking, then what about the chained god? Azek shook his head again as he said with a smiling sigh, in ancient times, she, or they might have had other names. That's right. Mr. Azek began the cycle of losing and finding his memories at the end of the 4th epoch. He kept wandering the northern continent, while the Rose School of Thought was born in the early 5th epoch in the southern continent. Klein nodded and didn't ask further. And since Azek had matters which needed his attention, he gave a few words of advice before bringing him to traverse across the spirit world until he arrived at a particular beach on the northern continent's eastern shore. With Mr. Azek gone, Klein looked at the seawater that kept surging towards the shore for a few seconds. He wasn't in a rush to head for the nearby city. Instead, he found an uninhabited cave, set up a simple ritual, and created a wall of spirituality. He sacrificed creeping hunger, death knell, Azek's copper whistle, Grozel's travels, and the soil with Senor's blood to the mysterious space above the gray fog. Then he walked 4 steps counterclockwise and entered the mysterious space. He took the seat which belonged to the fool, and he summoned a metal bottle. As it was stored above the gray fog, the remnant blood in the tiny bottle didn't coagulate. After wearing his glove and stuffing the other items, Klein poured a few drops and smeared it over Grozel's Travels' dark brown cover. But why doesn't a brand new story start right from the beginning with the addition of a new character? Klein looked at the book that didn't change its name as he suddenly felt puzzled. Before he had the time to think, his vision turned into a blur, as though there were countless translucent creatures hidden around him. Everything soon turned clear, and Klein found himself sitting on a long wooden chair along the street. This was where he had departed from previously. There's a saving function? Klein joked inwardly as he took out the mud stained with Señor's blood before snapping a tree branch to attempt divination. Following the results he received, he walked out of the city, entered a nearby forest, and found the unconscious Admiral of Blood beside a small stream. At this moment, only about 10 minutes had passed since the battle. The exaggerated wounds on Señor's neck, chest, and abdomen were contracting and appeared to have recovered significantly. Such a level of vitality was completely different from a human's. In another 15 to 30 minutes, Admiral of Blood would likely wake up, and in another 1 to 2 hours, his mobility would be restored. This was a zombie, a wraith. You had a chance of being rescued by your organization's angel and demigod, but your blood happened to splatter onto Grozel's travels, making you a prisoner of this book and giving me enough time to handle you. Of course, this made you avoid the stray attacks of the battle between demigods, preventing you from dying immediately. I've no idea if you'd call this good or bad luck. Klein mumbled as he observed while grasping Death Knell in his hand and reaching out to Señor's neck and removing the necklace made of pure silver. The necklace had a pendant of the same color which resembled an ancient coin. Both sides were filled with mysterious patterns and relevant symbols, as well as words carved in ancient Hermes. You will be as unlucky as you are lucky now. This is the mystical item which raises Admiral of Blood's luck? Unfortunately, even a demigod can't enhance my luck, so I doubt it can. I can sell it for money, or I could ask Miss Messenger if I can use this to make a partial payment. Klein wasn't in a hurry to take the necklace as he placed it on the stone beside him. He was afraid that there were unknown side effects that might affect the things he was about to do. Then, Klein focused as he controlled Admiral of Blood's spirit body threads. He wanted to make his first marionette which he would use for an extended period of time, so as to conclude the principles of a marionettist. Furthermore, no marionette was more convenient to bring around than a wraith. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. In just 10 seconds, Klein achieved initial control. Señor's spiritual intuition sensed the danger as his body showed obvious signs of struggling, but he was unable to wake up due to his heavy injuries and sluggish thoughts. Time ticked by, and by the 4th minute, Klein didn't hide his sigh of relief. At that moment, Admiral of Blood Señor opened his eyes, rolled to his feet, and faced him. With a harmonious series of actions, he pressed his chest and bowed. "Good morning, sir. How may I be of service?" Chapter 731. Gaines' illusory black threads emanated out of Señor's body and entered Klein's hands. With every jolt in spirituality, it gave a different reaction. In fact, there was no need to use both hands when controlling the spirit body threads. Klein was just accustomed to doing so, as it gave him a feeling like he was truly controlling a puppet. From the looks of it, other marionettists can discover each other's marionettes. The Señor's abnormality can't be hidden from their eyes, so I have to be careful about this. Klein concluded the problems he discovered, and he quickly turned his thoughts back onto Señor. This Admiral of Blood was dead. His spirit body had become a vessel for the marionette, losing any traits that belonged to him. Therefore, many divination methods were ineffective against him. Of course, methods to seek his corpse were still effective. Klein planned on cleansing the wraith in the gray fog before using paper angels to envelop the mirror-like objects that he had possessed before placing him into a cigar case that was sealed by a wall of spirituality, along with Azek's copper whistle. This created a 3-layered interference effect. This way, Klein believed that, even if the Rose School of Thought Angel wished to, it was impossible to use divination to lock onto his position via Admiral of Blood. As for whether the Mother Tree of Desire had left any backdoors in Señor's body, he wasn't too worried. This was because if that really happened, she could have mutated Señor during the demigod battle royale in order to deal with him. Based on the situation back then, there was a guaranteed chance of success. Mother Tree of Desire, or should I say, the chained god, strictly controls its organization's members. It relies on a vow contract and other methods that are ingrained into the soul. This can be inferred from Miss Sharon's descriptions and my interaction with the corresponding characteristics. As long as I don't attempt to use Admiral of Blood to divine the secrets of the Rose School of Thought or the potion formula of the mutant pathway, I wouldn't trigger any problems. The werewolf beyonder characteristic has remained normal despite being above the gray fog for so long. Besides, there's still the gray fog cleansing process. If there are any latent problems, it should be washed out. Klein thought for a while and took out Azek's copper whistle from inside his body. He turned his right wrist and made the side with fewer patterns appear under the sunlight, making it reflect the light. Immediately, the copper whistle had Senor's figure appear on it as it rapidly turned clear. The Admiral of Blood in front of Klein suddenly vanished as a result. Perhaps the Mother Tree of Desire can use the vow contract and other methods to vaguely lock on, but that doesn't matter. She can sense the gray fog's unique trait on me anyway, and she will sense me once I'm within range. Besides, this marionette might be destroyed at any time when I use it as a shield. Klein was like a jobless tramp who was debt-laden. He felt that there was almost nothing he was afraid of. Of course, he really was debt-ridden. As long as I advance to a demigod and can hide my unique trait, it's fine losing marionettes. Klein surveyed the area as he bent his back to pick up the silver necklace. He took 4 steps counterclockwise while chanting the incantation softly. This time, he hadn't entered via summoning his spirit body, so he couldn't directly return. The grayish-white fog was quickly emanated as hysterical ravings and roars echoed for an eternity. Azek's copper whistle didn't react abnormally, which meant that there weren't any latent problems with Admiral of Blood. Sitting at the end of the bronze table, Klein placed Azek's copper whistle in front of him, making Senor, who was dressed in a dark red coat and old triangular hat, appear. He was like a butler awaiting orders from his master. "Do you have any other items on you?" Klein asked, as though Admiral of Blood was still alive. This was his attempt to act as a marionettist. Following that, he controlled Senor, made him rummage through every pocket as he subsequently took out £325, 16 soli, and 8 pence in cash. There were also 13 gold coins. Apart from that, perhaps due to his frequent act of transforming into a wraith state, Senor didn't carry anything else on him. As a pirate admiral, you don't even have a single mystical item? Did you hand it over to the Rose School of Thought or your subordinates? Klein seriously considered cashing out Admiral of Blood via the black market. Just in loan alone, he was worth £42,000. Yes, claiming the bounty from loan isn't pragmatic. Be it the Church of Storms and the Kingdom's military, they will follow the clues to capture Gehrman Sparrow, who managed to embroil so many demigods in a battle royale, and then investigate the organization backing him. They wouldn't even pay, and they might even plant a trap. By the same logic, the churches and governments of other countries must have similar ideas. However, they might be easier to work with. Retrieving the bounty will require substantial risks. Besides, there's no rush. I'll send Senor out when I plan on switching marionettes. After all, being a marionette for a few days won't change his identity or value. Klein reined in his thoughts and cast his gaze on the silver necklace with an ancient coin attached to it. He immediately used divination to gain the gist of its origins and usage. It came from a Sequence 5 winner from the Life School of Thought. After dying at the hands of a Rose School of Thought demigod, this gentleman's beyonder characteristic and psyche fused with an ordinary silver necklace that he carried with him, turning into a mystical item. As for the reason why the ordinary silver necklace would be carried by a Sequence 5 powerhouse for extended periods of time, Klein was unable to receive any effective revelations from it, as it had been too long and it had been corrupted. The mystical item had 2 uses. One was to passively make the wearer lucky. In their daily lifestyle, the owner would encounter good things, easily succeeding in whatever they did. When suffering a lethal blow or terrifying disaster, ridiculous scenes would happen, allowing them to be successfully rescued. The latter situation only lasted for 10 minutes. The second use was to actively give an enemy bad luck, making the target unlucky. Be it in daily life or combat, It was easy for them to experience failure due to some trivial problem. The corresponding negative effects of the necklace was the conservation of luck. After being lucky, they would immediately meet with repeated bad luck. They would be as unlucky as they were lucky before. It needed the wearer to be devoted and seriously avoid any danger, otherwise, it was very easy for them to die in a comedic manner and even harm people around them. The luck received in one's daily life would often revert back after a month. The user would end up unlucky regardless of whether they wore it or not. However, such bad luck was slowly released, so it wasn't too dangerous. And luck obtained in combat would similarly strike back 10 minutes later in a similar vigor. Overall, this is a rather good mystical item, but I don't have much use for it. After all, Fate Counselor Ricardo was unable to change my luck. I'll just wear it on me for now. It has few negative effects on me. I'll sell it if there's a chance to pay off my debt with Miss Messenger. Miss Messenger wants gold coins while I have gold pounds. It's nearly impossible to exchange 10,000 gold coins through the banks or official markets. From the looks of it, I'll have to do it in batches, getting each Tarot Club member to change some of it. Klein soon decided on a plan as he casually came up with a name for the necklace, Scales of Luck. Following that, he cast his gaze onto Senor, who was standing reverently to his side. He began to study the powers a wraith had. Forceful possession, enemy control, wraith's shriek, mirror blink, obstacle penetration, death-related spells, and invisibility that wouldn't be discovered by most mid- and low-sequence Beyonders. Klein distinguished each power, and he matched them with Sharon's and Merrick's description, as well as his experience gained from combat. He soon concluded this, afraid that the candle in the outside world would finish burning. And a dark cave was extremely bad for the present him who had a phobia of the dark. Klein immediately took out a paper figurine from the junk pile, and together with the Black Emperor card, he stirred some of the powers above the gray fog, turning it into an anti-divination angel. This angel rapidly spread its wings and wrapped around a gold coin. On its reflective side was Senor's figure. Then, Klein brought the gold coin, Azek's copper whistle, death knell, and his suitcase back to the real world. As for Creeping Hunger and Grozel's travels, one of them hadn't been fed, and the other might cause Klein to be swallowed into the book for carrying it for too long. Therefore, they were left in the junk pile above the gray fog. Having returned to the cave, Klein hurriedly placed the gold coin and Azek's copper whistle into a cigar case before sealing it with a wall of spirituality. He cleaned up the scene, switched into formal clothes, and carried his suitcase. He followed the beach until he came to a residential area. He discovered that he was near Pritz Harbor. He didn't immediately return to Backlund. Instead, he changed his appearance, took a steam locomotive, and headed for Conant City in Desi Bay. He planned on circling the area once before changing his identity again. Bansi Harbor. Alger Wilson looked at the destroyed city under the afternoon sun. He saw that the buildings had completely collapsed, and there were deep chasms in the ground and charred spots everywhere. Such a scene extended into the depths of the island. Even the mountain had collapsed. At that moment, there wasn't anyone from the Church of Storms watching the ruins, since there wasn't anything here. And the plans to rebuild the harbor wasn't brought forward at all. Alger jumped off the Blue Avenger and circled the ruins with his sailors, but they didn't discover anything of value. "Let's go," he instructed with a staid attitude. He soon boarded the ship which hoisted its sails and left the island. After an unknown period of time, a figure suddenly walked out from the depths of the ruins. He wore a double-breasted, pure black clerical robe. He had dark golden hair, and his facial features were clear and distinct, like an ancient, classical sculpture. His eyes were dark blue, nearing black. They looked lusterless, but they were filled with dense blood capillaries. Chapter 732, Destination Desi County, Conant City, 67 Red Indus Street. Wearing a commonly seen face in the Lone Kingdom, Klein took a step forward and rang the doorbell. In less than a minute, the door creaked open as a maidservant looked out and asked out of curiosity, "Good evening, who might you be looking for?" "I'm here to find Ma'am Nilu. I'm a friend of her father, Davy Raymond," Klein answered calmly. Derek Raymond was the nightmare who he had released from Creeping Hunger. It was a red glove from the Nighthawks, and the first thing on his mind before he dissipated was his daughter, Neela Raymond. He was very apologetic towards her for not spending time with her while she grew up, making her effectively lose her father when she had already lost her mother. Klein had promised him that he would make a visit to the beautiful coastal city if he had the chance to visit his daughter. Having probed for more information earlier, Klein had gained a general idea about Neela Raymond's situation. After this girl graduated from grammar school, she worked at the Women and Children Care Foundation, which was run by the Church of the Evernight Goddess. She had a weekly salary of £2.10 solely and was the target of envy by her neighbors. She also inherited an inheritance from her businessman father. As for how much it was, no one knew. They just knew that she was richer than most people from the middle class. Typically speaking, women with such wealth would place great emphasis on their marriage. They would repeatedly select and observe candidates, resulting in their late marriage. However, Neela had married to a civil servant just a year later. As both parties were believers of the Evernight Goddess, she didn't take on her husband's last name. She continued going by the name Neela Raymond, and she continued staying at 67 Red Indus Street. After hearing Klein's answer, the maidservant quickly requested him to wait as she entered the living room to report to her mistress. Before long, a woman in a home dress walked to the door. She had black hair and blue eyes. Her face was rather thin, and she was rather pretty. She resembled Davy Raymond. "Good evening, sir. I'm Neela, Davy Raymond's daughter. May I know when you got to know my father?" Neela Raymond asked politely but warily. Klein took off his hat and smiled. "I got to know him at sea. It's been several years." Neela Raymond swept him with a wary gaze and said, "Perhaps you might not know, but he has already passed away." Klein sighed and replied, "Yes, I know. I got to know him through that disaster. He had some words to say back then which I didn't think too much about. However, the more I thought about it in recent years, the more I felt that I should inform you." "Is that so?" Neela said softly. After some thought, she invited him. "Please come in. Would you mind if my husband listens in?" "This is up to you to decide," Klein frankly replied. Neela nodded and led Klein into the study. Her husband had the looks of an ordinary civil servant with a gentleman's bearing. He put down his newspapers and followed them in. After both parties sat down, Klein looked at the couple on the sofa and deliberated. Mr. Davy Raymond once experienced disaster after another. He lost his father, mother, wife, brothers, and sisters. Neela nodded with a deadpan expression. "I know," Klein thought and continued. "He appears to be a merchant, but he was in fact seeking out the murderers who caused that disaster." "I know." Neela didn't object to it. Klein glanced at her and continued, "He dedicated himself to this matter, and he was very regretful that he didn't manage to spend time with you growing up, making you lose your father alongside your mother." Neela fell silent for a second before she rapidly replied, "I know." Klein swept his gaze to the old books around him and sighed silently. "He said that his greatest wish was to see you enter the hall of marriage under the witness of the goddess, to have your own family, and to not be lonely anymore. I believe he should be very happy right now." Neela's gaze slowly moved away from Klein's face as she turned Agape, answering only 2 seconds later. "I know." Klein leaned forward slightly as he clasped his hands. "He said that he might die at sea, and he wanted me to tell you that he died as a result of an accident. All the murderers from before have already been punished. You do not need to hate anyone. He also said that he loves you very much and that he's very sorry." Neela remained silent for a few seconds as she blinked. She turned her head to the side and scoffed with an unclear attitude. "Got it?" Klein gave her a deep look before getting up. "I'm done passing on the message. It's time I leave." Met with silence, Neela's husband nodded gently as a gesture of thanks. Klein turned around, walked to the door of the study. Just as he twisted the doorknob, Neela Raymond's voice sounded from behind him, deep and hoarse. "What kind of person do you think he was?" Klein fell silent for a second, turned his head, and curled his lips. He said with a smile, "A guardian." He didn't stay any longer as he opened the door and walked to the coat rack. When he wore his hat and left 67 Red Indus Street, soft, restrained sobbing suddenly drilled into his ears. Shaking his head silently, Klein left the burrow and entered a cathedral of the Evernight goddess. Passing through the dark and serene aisle, he sat in the 7th row from the back. He faced the crimson half-moon and the black sacred emblem filled with resplendent stars. He took off his hat, lowered his head, and held his hands to his mouth, just like the many believers present. While praying silently in the silence and tranquility, time quickly passed. Klein slowly opened his eyes as he gently stood up. At the spot where he sat, he left behind an item wrapped in paper. Klein walked along the aisle and left the prayer hall, going straight to the cathedral's entrance. With his back facing the hall, he wore his hat, raised his right hand, and snapped his fingers. The paper suddenly ignited where he sat, garnering the priest's attention. When this gentleman rushed over, the flames had already extinguished, leaving behind a dark gem-like item. Although the priest didn't know what the item was, his spiritual perception told him that it was very important. When he and the other priests rushed outside the cathedral, the gentleman in a tailcoat and half-top hat had already disappeared. The next morning, through a local black market, Klein had obtained a new identity as he came to the steam locomotive station. In his hand was a second-class ticket worth 18 soldi, as well as identification documents for himself. He held a black leather suitcase as he stood at the platform with his back straight, awaiting the arrival of the train headed for Backlund. The present him was a middle-aged man who was nearing his 40s. He was slightly more than 180 centimeters tall, and his black hair had a few silver strands. His deep blue eyes were like a lake at night, and he was rather good-looking. He gave off mature and elegant vibes. Looking down at the identification documents, Klein's eyes reflected his present name, Dwayne Dantes. After some thought, he placed the suitcase on the ground, laid it down, and opened it before stuffing all his identification documents inside. Inside the suitcase, there was a black wooden box containing the former lone soldier, Frunzier Edwards' ashes. Moments after arranging his suitcase, he heard a whistle. A steam train chugged into the station spewing smoke before it slowed down to a halt. He looked up and cast his gaze forward as he examined it in silence. Then he looked down at his suitcase and whispered, "It's time to return." He then stood straight, carried his belongings, and walked to the open carriage door. Backlund, Sherwood Backlund, 26 Gunstead Street. Benson took off his hat, removed his coat, and handed it to the maidservant. He looked at his sister, Melissa, who was glued to her book in the living room. The entrance examinations are in June. You'll finally experience the pain of studiously studying that I endured back then. Melissa didn't look up as she continued reading. I'm studiously studying every day. A little humor, Melissa. A little humor. What's the difference between a person without humor and a curly-haired baboon? Benson said with a smile. Melissa casually glanced at him and said, "That wasn't what you said in the past." She didn't correct him on what the exact difference was between humans and curly-haired baboons, and she instead said, "Do civil servants also finish work so late?" "No, there's been a lot of work recently. As you know, oh, you don't." In such a huge reform, the handing over of work and the straightening out of different relationships are very troublesome. Benson swept the mirror in the living room. He couldn't help but lift his hand to comb his hair as he said with a look of displeasure, "Although I'm only a low-ranking employee in the Ministry of Finance, that doesn't stop me from having plenty of work. The only thing to be happy about it that I've finally survived the darn probationary period. I'll soon have a weekly salary of £3. Melissa put down her book, and she walked to the dining hall and said to Benson, "It's dinner time." She paused and said very seriously, "I read in the papers that there's something called Donningsman tree sap that has a significant effect on boosting hair growth." Benson's face immediately had mixed expressions. Amidst the whistle, the long steam locomotive chugged into Backlund. Klein picked up his suitcase and once again stepped into the capital of capitals, the land of hope. He discovered that the smog had thinned significantly, and there wasn't the obvious palish yellow colors. The gas street lamps on the platform were already turned on, dispersing the gloominess and darkness. Surveying the area, Klein walked out the steam locomotive station, took the metro and a carriage, and came to a Church of Storms cemetery outside Westboro. Then he spent a little bit of money and placed Frunzier Edwards' ashes into a partition. By then, this lone soldier had already left Backlund for more than 165 years. After taking a step back, Klein observed it for a moment before using a pen and paper to engrave something on the partition door: Frunzier Edward. He closed his eyes and added, "Every journey has its destination." Chapter 733. The return. Under a persistent rain, mingled with the thin fog, the rows of street lamps tried their hardest to shine through the mist. The occasional horse carriage that proceeded down the streets was a common evening sight in Backlund. Apart from these, Klein noticed a few gratifying changes while standing behind the window. Ring. A crisp sound echoed in the air as a two-wheeled mechanical device rushed down the side of the street to the other end of the street. Its frame was black in color, with some parts revealing grayish-white steel. Under the illumination of the street lamps and rain, it sparkled with the beauty of metal. On this device sat a man dressed in a postman's uniform. He kept pedaling with his legs, apparently using a great deal of strength. Behind him was a wooden box that had been painted in green. "It's been promoted very well." The white shirt, black-vested, mature-looking Klein sighed inwardly when he saw this scene. In a few hours within his return to Backlund, he noticed many similar mechanical devices, and they were none other than the bicycles that he had promoted and invested in. From the newspapers, Klein knew that the Backlund Bike Company had done tons of advertisements. It even held a bicycle competition in boroughs like Cherwood and Backlund Bridge so as to garner the attention of others. Apart from that, they also actively promoted it to the government departments such as the Postal Service and the police departments. The results were said to be pretty good. Their pricing strategy had followed Klein's original suggestion, avoiding the middle-upper class who often used horse carriages. Instead, they aimed their target audience at those with weekly salaries of £1.10 solely and above, such as technical workers, students with a decent family background, and clerical employees that often needed to travel outside. Therefore, a bike worth £3 to £5 was affordable for the people in this demographic if they bit the bullet a little. And at the same time, they could flaunt it to the masses who had incomes that were lower than them. The current issue is that Backlund often rains. It's difficult to hold an umbrella while riding a bicycle. The next step should be a raincoat. Klein retracted his gaze, shook his head, and chuckled. The place he stayed at was a high-end hotel in the Hillston borough. It cost him 10 solely a night, making him feel quite the pinch. However, to match his persona, all he could do was bite the bullet and put up with it. His idea of Dwayne Dantes was that he was a believer of the Evernight goddess and a mysterious tycoon that came from Desi Bay. He had sold his original land and mines, planning to seek out brand new opportunities in Backlund. He had a certain level of interest in obtaining an aristocratic title, but he didn't have the abundant wealth to do so. He had to first expand his social circle and begin making some investments. The benefits of this identity was that it was clearly different from the characters Klein had previously acted as. It allowed him to very naturally interact with people from the middle-upper class, especially members of the Military Officers Club and the Backlund Diocese bishops of the Church of the Evernight Goddess. It made it convenient for Klein to continue his investigations into the Great Smog of Backlund while gathering intel before he made detailed plans to steal the Antigonus family's notebook. There were obvious disadvantages as well. Such a mysterious tycoon would definitely catch the notice of the Nighthawks and mandated punishers, so there was a certain level of background checks that he would have to undergo. According to Klein's experience, such an investigation would be done by the official Beyonder organizations under the premise that nothing important had happened. It could also be handed over to the police department, but in summary, not too much effort would be put into it, as it would be considered a routine check. Therefore, Klein, who was considered quite an expert at disguises, had prepared a second layer to his identity as Dwayne Dantes to his designs, so as to deal with the background inspection. This second layer to his identity was that Dwayne Dantes was a person who had adventured in the southern continent's East and West Balam for some particular reason. He had used a nickname, and he spent more than 10 years in that rather dangerous land filled with opportunity in order to amass a great deal of wealth. Since the origin of his wealth wasn't overboard, he had secretly returned to Desi Bay, and he forged a new identity. He had planned on beginning a new life in Backlund and gradually legalize his wealth. It wasn't rare to see such people in Lone. Their stories were acceptable and imaginable for an investigation. For this identity layer, Klein had left some inconspicuous clues in Conant City so as to indirectly reveal the truth. These clues included but were not limited to the stubs of his scalped tickets from East Balham to Conant City, habits as a result of living in the southern continent for extended periods of time, as well as his wealth of unknown origins. Klein believed that as long as Dwayne Dantes didn't involve himself in any serious Beyonder matters, preparations such as this were enough to fool most routine background inspections. And if he encountered an extremely dedicated official Beyonder who investigated it all the way and was even willing to seek the help of colleagues from the southern continent, then Dwayne Dantes had a third identity layer. It was that he was a cheat who had anti-divination measures to a certain degree. He disguised himself as a mysterious tycoon and spent large amounts of money in investments for this final scam. This identity was enough to get Dwayne Dantes arrested, but the level of attention placed on him wouldn't be too great. This allowed Klein to exit the stage without much trouble. Compared to my first time in Backlund, the creation of a three-layered identity shows how I've really matured significantly. Klein slowly walked to the middle of the room as he cast his gaze on a full-body mirror in the corner. His reflection had black hair and some strands of gray hair. His eyes were deep, but his experiences had left indelible marks on his face. He was a charming middle-aged man with a mature bearing. The design of Dwayne Dantes's identity wasn't difficult for the present Klein. However, stealing the Antigonus family's notebook from behind St. Samuel Cathedral's Cheney's Gate was practically an impossible task for any external Beyonder. Even a king of angels couldn't guarantee success. Of course, unlike other Beyonders, Klein had two advantages. First, he was once a Nighthawk. He had quite a good understanding of the internal procedures they followed, and he knew which matters he could exploit. Therefore, the first solution he eliminated was to become a particular Nighthawk, infiltrate it, and find a chance to pass through Cheney's Gate. There was a problem that existed in this. Nighthawks weren't able to randomly enter Cheney's Gate, even for the captains and deacons. Something had to happen first before they received the corresponding authority. Furthermore, Cheney's Gate had its keepers inside. Randomly entering or taking things would result in an attack on him, causing a battle to break out. Klein didn't wish for his theft to result in any deaths or injury to the members of the Church of the Goddess. After careful consideration, he placed his sights on the keepers. These elders were retired Nighthawks who volunteered to enter Cheney's Gate. They were in charge of watching the sealed artifacts, and they were from a different department from the Nighthawks. They entered and exited using the underground passageway through the cathedral, and they never interfered with the Nighthawks' work, nor would they be disturbed by the Nighthawks. Perhaps a result of staying behind Cheney's Gate for extended periods of time, these keepers all had certain traits. They had cold auras and had deadpan expressions. Their skin was pale, and they resembled monsters from the deep darkness who were on the border of life and death. Klein believed that it wasn't difficult for him to locate his target if he met one. His initial plan was to rent a place in Northborough near St. Samuel Cathedral. He would hire a butler, a valet, a maidservant, a gardener, a chef, and a carriage driver to have a front as a tycoon. Then he would often head to the cathedral to pray piously, participate in mass, donate money, and familiarize himself with the bishops and priests. During this process, he would work hard to find suspected keepers. He would choose 2 or 3 targets and observe their habits. When the opportunity arises, he would imprison one of them, change into his appearance or directly possess him, pass through Cheney's Gate, and attempt to flip through or take the Antigonus family's notebook away. This was a very crude plan that was merely a train of thought. It needed to be perfected according to the intelligence Klein would slowly acquire. For this matter, Klein's second advantage was the Tarot Club. He had assistants that the Church of the Evernight Goddess and the Nighthawks would never think of. Furthermore, he could consider extending the recruitment of a Backlund diocese Nighthawk or keeper into the gathering. He could then complete the theft through this traitor, just like how Emperor Roselle was used to obtain the Antigonus family's notebook by Zeradol. I've got to frequently head to the cathedral. Only by doing so can I find a target. Klein faced the mirror as he silently nodded. It had to be said that he felt conflicted. If a true Nighthawk or Keeper were to betray the church to serve Mr. Fool, his first thought was to unleash divine punishment to get rid of this despicable traitor. After exhaling, he gave a self-deprecating laugh. He wore his double-breasted frock coat and hat, walked out the room and reached the streets. With an umbrella, he circled to another street. Taking advantage of the distant street lamp and the drizzle, he suddenly changed back into Sherlock Moriarty. Glancing at his wrinkled trousers, Klein stopped a carriage and planned on heading to Isengard Stanton's house in Hillston Borough. Half an hour later, the somewhat ancient and dark building appeared before Klein's eyes. He paid 2 soldi for his ride as he walked steadily around the puddles amidst the drizzle that refracted the yellowish light of dusk before coming to the famous detective's doorstep. Putting away his umbrella, he reached out to ring the doorbell and waited for a moment before seeing a man with a wide face open the door. The man had a head of malt-colored hair, grayish-blue eyes, and high cheekbones. He had the traits of someone from Lemberg or Mason. Mr. Isengard Stanton's new assistant? Someone from the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom? Klein took off his hat and said with a smile, "Good evening, is Mr. Isengard Stanton home?" "He is. He just had his dinner after a busy day at work," the malt-colored lad replied politely. "May I know who you are?" Klein chortled and said, "Tell the good detective that a friend of his has returned from his vacation." The young man was taken aback as he blurted out, "Mr. Sherlock Moriarty?" Chapter 734. Old friends, you actually know me? This means that Mr. Isengard Stanton often mentions me as a friend, or does it mean that the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom knows that I was embroiled in the great smog of Backland? Klein smiled as he nodded in an unperturbed manner. "Yes, I'm Sherlock Moriarty." The grayish-blue-eyed lad immediately gave way as he warmly gestured him in. "Mr. Stanton has been worried about you all this time. He was afraid that you met with trouble. He can now be at peace." Klein handed him his umbrella as he took off his hat and coat while walking in. At this moment, Isengard Stanton, who had sensed something, had put down his papers and pipe, and he left his reclining chair to take a look. "Oh my, Sherlock, you're finally back. It's been so long, my friend." The thin Isengard with grayed sides revealed a smile as he came over with welcoming arms in an attempt to give him a greeting hug. Klein wasn't used to such a custom, so he forced himself to reciprocate it and smile. "Mr. Stanton, this isn't something a believer of wisdom would do." The bishops and priests of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom had their pride, and they seldom gave greeting hugs. But in fact, apart from the boorish Fasak Empire and the liberal Intis Kingdom, such a manner of etiquette was rare in other countries and regions. It only happened among very familiar friends. Isengard took 2 steps back and chuckled. "No, Sherlock. We're never stingy with respect and friendliness towards intelligent friends. In my heart, you're one of the top 5 detectives in all of Backland." "I like that." Klein smiled inwardly as he retorted in jest, "So you're one of the top 3 detectives?" To be praised as having true wisdom by a sequence 7 believer of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom was really delighting. "I wish that you share the same thoughts as myself," Isengard skillfully and gently replied. Then he invited him to the living room and to the sofa. He leaned into a reclining chair and picked up his pipe. With a deep breath, he exhaled. "I'm very happy that nothing bad happened to you. You seem especially fine, both in body and mind. How was it? Was Desi Bay fun?" Klein had already prepared an excuse as he calmly smiled. "In fact, I didn't go to Desi Bay. I ended up going to Constant. Heh, I was previously embroiled in some trouble in Backland, so I could only find a place to hide." Sherlock Moriarty was a gentleman from mid-Seashire who had a slight accent. It was a very normal choice to return to his hometown after causing trouble. Constant was mid-Seashire's capital. "I know," Isengard replied heavily. He didn't inquire about the trouble which Sherlock had involved himself in. Instead, he said with a smile, "In short, welcome back to Backland. Come to me if you need any help." Klein didn't stand on ceremony as he immediately said, "The purpose of my visit was first because it really has been a while since we last met, and second, I wish that you can sell my shares in the Backlund Bike Company on my behalf. Haha, all the documents are in place, and there's no need to carry out any other procedures." In order to act as a mysterious tycoon and to repay Miss Messenger with the 10,000 gold coins, not only did he plan on selling items he had little use for, but he also planned on letting go of the last 10% of his shares in the Backlund Bike Company. After all, Sherlock Moriarty wasn't able to appear in a legitimate fashion for a long period of time. "Are you really going to sell it?" Isengard stroked his pipe and said, "Although I've never been a businessman, I can tell that the bike is a product that's of great value and something that can be promoted on a large scale. Its commercial future is like the newly risen sun, and it has yet to reach its limits. You'll be losing plenty of money by selling it now. That's why a buyer will be very willing to raise the price significantly because of this expected value." Klein chuckled. "I believe the people who can tell the value of the bike and its future aren't in the minority. And Framiz and Leopard are definitely unwilling to reduce any part of their holdings at this stage. There shouldn't be a problem selling my 10% shares at twice or thrice the normal price. Isengard, the pricing of shares isn't about the present, but about its future. To illustrate an alluring story for the buyer and investor, and drawing a beautiful future is very necessary. Of course, the value and future of the bike don't require additional input from me. Anyone with any business sense can tell. The only problem stems in the rubber production." Klein silently added inwardly, "The pricing of shares isn't about the present, but about its future." Isengard softly repeated Klein's words, and after a moment he sincerely sighed. "Sherlock, perhaps you should be involved in the business world. However, there will always be many accidents present. To dare to take risks is equivalent to chivalry in business." "Oh well, I admit that I've recently been in dire need of large sums of cash," Klein replied with a smile. Isengard picked up his pipe as he gave it a satisfactory suck. "You've convinced me. I will specially hire a lawyer and accountant to confirm the market value of Backlund Bike Company. Then, I'll add on an estimate of the expected profits and sell that 10% of yours. The corresponding fees and taxes will be deducted from the amount received." "Oh, how should I contact you? It seems like your rental contract for the house at Minsk Street has lapsed." Klein obviously wouldn't expose his present identity. He said, having prepared for it, "You can post news on the Tussock Times, Backlund Daily Tribune, and other newspapers about the sale of the shares to make more people know. Only when there's competition would there be better price negotiations. When it's sold, you can publish a notice to indicate that the deal has been closed and that further inquiries won't be entertained. And when I see that notice, I'll come visit you." Isengard was no stranger when it came to communicating over published notices in the newspapers. He nodded and said, "No problem. Of course, all expenses will be deducted from the final sum received." With his main goal accomplished, Klein stood up and reached out his hand. "Thank you for your help, Isengard. I need to leave. We can talk in the future." Isengard didn't hold him back as he sent him straight out the door. Klein circled to a nearby street and took a carriage to the Braveheart's bar as he admired Braveheart's bar's night view in the drizzle. He planned on re-establishing all the news and resource channels which Sherlock Moriarty used to have. After entering the noisy bar, he didn't head for the bar counter to order some beer and make inquiries. Instead, he circled around the boxing ring in preparation to leave, so that he could wait for Miss Sharon to appear on the carriage outside. At this moment, the door to a billiard room creaked open. Ian, with an old coat, walked out with newspapers in hand. His red eyes did a cursory sweep when he suddenly noticed a familiar figure. He gaped his mouth, but he didn't say his name. He greeted in pleasant surprise, "Good evening, sir. Is there anything I can help you with?" "Not for now. I'm only here to visit an old friend." Klein smiled warmly. As he spoke, he noticed that the papers in Ian's hand was news at sea. On it was a striking headline, "Shocking. Crazy adventurer made a fugitive." Crazy adventure. Klein intuitively believed that it had nothing to do with him. Ian noticed his gaze and raised the newspapers with a smile. This is one of the rare up-to-date reports from news at sea because the bounties have already appeared in various places. The crazy adventurer, Gehrman Sparrow, plotted to bring harm on the city of generosity, and he has been proven to be a member of a cult. In this incident, thanks to the Church of Storms and the military, no one from Byam was injured. But Admiral of Blood Senor, who was involved in the matter, vanished as a result. It's suspected that he has been killed by Gehrman Sparrow. Guess how much of a bounty they are offering for Gehrman Sparrow? £50,000. It has exceeded Admiral of Blood's, and it's almost reached that of Admiral Hell's. £50,000. Klein's heart stirred. He calmed the palpitations in his heart as he replied with a smile, "Unfortunately, few people can claim such a bounty." He pointed at the bar's entrance and said, "I'll come to look for you again when I have the time." "All right." Ian didn't ask further as he mentioned in passing, "Is Mr. White from the Harvest Church your friend?" "That fellow, Emlyn, is finally willing to get out of the house." "For those primordial moon believers?" Klein nodded. "That's right." After saying that, he squeezed through the crowd and pushed open the door to leave the Bravehearts bar. After getting onto a rental carriage, Klein cast his gaze outside, awaiting Miss Sharon's appearance. Of course, he wasn't certain that she was here. Months had passed, so it was very possible that this lady and Merrick had switched their area of activity. Silently, Klein's spiritual perception was triggered as he turned to look at the window. On the glass which could reflect the night view, a young lady in a black bonnet and Gothic-styled black dress clearly appeared. Turning his head, Klein saw Miss Sharon sitting opposite him. Her pale blonde hair, blue eyes, and pale expression didn't seem any different from before. "Good evening." Klein, who no longer needed to act as Gehrman Sparrow, greeted first. Sharon got up a little and curtsied. Realizing that she might have read news at sea, he was momentarily unable to find a topic for small talk. He cleared his throat and directly said, "I killed Senor." "Okay." Sharon nodded slightly, indicating that she was aware. Klein smiled as he continued, "If Merrick still needs the beyonder characteristic of a wraith, he can wait and prepare the money needed. Once I find a replacement, I'll sell Senor to him." Sharon didn't ask what replacement meant as she replied, "After seeing that piece of news, he has been awaiting your return." "Very good." Klein chuckled. He reached out for his collar, pulled out a silver necklace and said, "Senor's lucky item. You should know about it, right?" Sharon tersely answered as she waited for Klein to continue. "I plan to sell either this or the biological poison bottle. Would you or people from your circle be interested?" Klein took the initiative to ask. Chapter 735. Another visit. Sharon was silent for 2 seconds before she said, "I'll help ask." "It means you need to consider it?" "That's right. The negative effects of scales of luck does leave one hesitant. However, biological poison bottle is really compatible with a wraith. If it wasn't because I'm short on money, and how it lowers my immunity, making me easily fall sick, I wouldn't be willing to sell it. It's rather effective in an ambush." Klein vaguely grasped Sharon's intentions as he stuffed the silver necklace back into his collar. He asked after some thought, "Which power of a high-sequence prisoner pathway beyonder makes all surrounding lifeless items attack one's target?" "Puppet," Sharon succinctly replied. "It's the power of a sequence 4 puppet, turning themselves into a lifeless puppet, so that they are able to control all lifeless objects in a certain range. Advancing further, will they be able to directly influence the mystical items of an enemy?" Klein nodded in enlightenment and asked, "Then, do you know that demigod?" He immediately described in detail the appearance of the elder who had attacked him outside Byam. "Shanks," Sharon calmly said a name. "I actually wish that you could share with me more about him." Klein knew Miss Sharon's style as he said with an exasperated smile, "Then, do you know Zatwin?" He was the mentor of the Naturism sect's leader in Oravi Island. "The demigod who was pursuing us," Sharon answered without hiding anything or any emotions, like a doll. "That's the one who made me feel like the chairs, tables, and curtains wished to kill me. What a coincidence. However, it wasn't arranged. It just proves that as a secret organization, the Rose School of Thought, with a history of over 1,000 years, doesn't have that many demigods. Perhaps it has about the same number as the Aurora Order. The number of saints number around 5, and the number of angels and Grade 0 sealed artifacts number about 2 to 3. Of course, this is also because they were suppressed by the 7 major churches, reducing their headquarters to colonies. At the height of their powers, they might have had far more than these. Klein thought and asked again, then, do you know the Rose School of Thought member that is able to make an entire mountain tremble with just one arm? He planned on describing the arm traits, but he realized that he hadn't dared to look straight at it. Sharon listened quietly as her eyes darted around as though they came to life. She asked with a clear voice, "What did you encounter?" "A saint, an angel, as well as Sea King, an Aurora Order demigod, a monster byproduct from the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death." Klein silently made a self-deprecating comment as he said with a wry smile, "I got on the bad side with the Mother Tree of Desire, and I suffered an ambush from the Rose School of Thought. Thankfully, I was in Biam, allowing the Church of Storms and the Kingdom's military to take action. I also threw out an item corrupted with the true Creator's aura, as well as something related to the Numinous Episcopate. In short, it was chaos, and I took the opportunity to escape." He replied frankly, apart from hiding the existence of Miss Messenger and Mr. Azek. As for the matter of the true Creator, he believed that Miss Sharon had long known that he wasn't affected by the ravings. This could be explained by a timely psychological intervention or psychic treatment. Mother Tree of Desire. Sharon murmured the name as rare emotional upheavals slowly appeared in her eyes. Klein didn't have the interpretation abilities of a spectator, and he was unable to tell what was exactly on Sharon's mind. He could only sense that she felt a little fear and loathing. Sharon quickly restrained her abnormal reaction, turning back into an extremely exquisite doll. She looked at Sherlock Moriarty and said, "You are very lucky and very mysterious." Klein smiled without a word, neither lying nor explaining. Sharon didn't inquire as she said, "You might have met Sua. He is an abomination born 922 years ago and claims to be the son of the chained god. Is also the present leader of the Rose School of Thought." "No way. The Rose School of Thought sent its leader and a demigod to deal with me. I'm just a mere Sequence 5. If not for Orange Light Hilarian's warning, I might have already been captured by the Rose School of Thought." Klein felt a chill run down his back again as he asked, "Is Abomination the name of the Prisoner Pathways Sequence 2 or Sequence 1? "Probably." Sharon didn't give an affirmative answer. At this moment, without waiting for Klein's response, she said, "William Street has been destroyed." Klein had pondered what kind of reaction he should have when Miss Sharon raised the topic, so he immediately frowned. "By who? When did it happen?" "The Nighthawks and Machinery Hive Mind. About 2 months ago." Sharon had clearly gathered the corresponding intelligence. Klein nodded solemnly and, after some deep thought, said, "Perhaps we've neglected something. That evil spirit didn't need us to rescue it. It was still controlling Baronet Pound. Could it be that something happened to that gentleman, incurring the notice of the Nighthawks and Machinery Hive Minds?" Klein offered a guess filled with half-truths without utmost confidence. Sharon nodded. "Baronet Pound died during one of his revelries." "That's it? That's the end to Alista Tudor's final bloodline?" Klein thought and said, "How's the situation with William Street at the moment?" "Some high-rise buildings are being built," Sharon described without much of an expression. "People monitored it in secret at the beginning, but the surveillance decreased with time, diminishing to 0 early last month." Klein pondered for a few seconds and said, "Have you gone down to explore it?" Sharon's eyes swept his face. "No. This is her remembering our unwritten agreement, to explore it together because we found it together? What a noble-hearted lady. The Rose School of Thought's Temperance faction is infinitely times better than the Indulgence faction." Klein probed, "Shall we go now?" "All right." Sharon succinctly expressed her stance. Klein immediately instructed the carriage driver, and he changed the destination to William Street at the intersection of West Borough and Empress Borough. Along the way, he casually mentioned what he heard and saw at sea, as well as the experiences that didn't involve his secrets. Although Sharon didn't answer him, she listened attentively, seemingly interested. This made Klein recall the time when he first got to know her as Miss Bodyguard. She sat on the illusory high-back chair in the oriel window's glass. Her right hand held her cheek as she seriously listened to his conversation with Ian. She had great potential in being a spectator. The carriage passed through the silent streets in the drizzle before finally arriving near William Street. Without approaching the area, Klein and Sharon discovered that the area had become a huge worksite. After circling to the region that matched the underground ruins, they stood behind a huge tree with a lush canopy. Klein said to Sharon, who wasn't drenched by the rain despite not holding an umbrella, "Let's head down." As the rain fell, they passed through Sharon's blonde hair and body before hitting the ground. "All right." Sharon didn't ask how Sherlock Moriarty was planning on heading down with her. Klein reached his hand into his pocket and easily removed the wall of spirituality, and he opened the iron cigar case. Beside him, a figure suddenly appeared. It was none other than Admiral of Blood Senor, who wore a dark red coat and an old triangular hat. "He will head down in my stead," Klein said with a smile. Immediately following that, he controlled his marionette in a composed manner. Senor immediately pressed his hand to his chest and bowed at Sharon. "Good evening. I'm honored to work with you." Sharon swept her gaze across Klein and Senor, and without a word, her body sank into the soil. Miss Sharon seems to detest Senor quite significantly." Klein curled his lips and made Admiral of Blood rapidly turn into a wraith and sink. As for himself, he leaned on a tree, half closed his eyes as he seriously controlled the marionette. There wasn't anyone around him, and the drizzle was light and the streetlights dim. Slowly, Klein found the feeling of being a marionettist. His vision and Senor's vision overlapped with one another as he saw black-brown soil, squirming worms, and miscellaneous items in between the rocks. As they passed through layers of obstacles, they arrived at the region where the ruin once was. The dome's ceiling had collapsed and the stone columns had snapped. The area was filled with soil and rubble, looking nothing like it once was. Such a scene made Klein believe that the humanoid statues of the six deities had been completely destroyed. To his joy, their location was relatively close to the room which sealed the evil spirit. That meant that he didn't need to worry that any subsequent exploration would exceed the 100-meter range for the control of his marionette. Amidst the smell of soil and rot, they soon entered the previously menacing room. However, between the rubble and soil, there were only a few signs of crushed bone and rotting clothes. The dark gold and deep blue light from before had all vanished. The Beyonder characteristics have been taken away by the Nighthawks and Machinery Hivemind. Senor's expression twitched as it perfectly reflected Klein's mood. Sharon turned around in the dark solid environment and gently shook her head. "They didn't send anyone in. There are no traces of living creatures existing in here." That's right. If a living person had entered and exited this room over the past half-year, a wraith should be able to sense it. Besides, the deity statues obviously cannot be seen by the Nighthawks and Machinery Hivemind. Where did those Beyonder characteristics go? As Klein frowned, Senor had a similar reaction. Could it be that the evil spirit wasn't completely obliterated? It had long escaped? Klein thought about it when he suddenly came to an alarming conclusion. He held back his emotions and made Senor pass through the soil and rubble-filled room with Sharon, and they arrived at the spot where the bloody door previously stood. And at that moment, only a few splinters proved that it existed before. After proceeding forward a few meters, the two truly entered the room where the evil spirit was sealed. It had likewise been destroyed and buried. Klein used Senor's body and eyes to look for clues as he flew about. "There should be a black high-back chair here." Sharon stopped and pointed at the splinters above two rocks. Klein instantly recalled the scene he had once seen in the dream. The young man suspected of being Medici had sat on a high-back chair, his head drooped low as though dead. Sharon didn't pause. She continued proceeding in the compressed soil in search for any traces. Suddenly, she spoke again. "There should be one here." "Another one? A second black high-back chair?" Klein floated over in surprise. Chapter 736. Third chair. Senor, in his wraith form, passed through the thick soil and rocks under Klein's control, arriving beside Sharon. He saw a damaged armrest which had asymmetrical patterns buried there, looking rather similar, but also different from the splinters they discovered moments ago. The armrest wasn't pure black in color. Their patterns exuded a dark red color, as though it was an intersection of iron and blood. Recalling the scene from his nightmare, Klein determined that this wasn't the high-back chair that the entity suspected to be Medici sat on. This was the second chair. The room that sealed the evil spirit had at least 2 high-back chairs. Klein and Sharon didn't say a word as they circled around in different directions to search for other clues. Before long, they discovered the evidence of a third high-back chair. It was the leg of a chair, mainly dark red in color with pure black patterns. It was completely different from the other 2 kinds of splinters. Perhaps it's a problem caused by the asymmetrical trait of the 4th epoch? Klein knew Sharon's style, volunteering to speak and saying something even he couldn't believe. In the nightmare that resulted from the evil spirit's influence, the colors of the high-back chairs were, at the very least, uniform. Sharon shook her head slightly. 3 has more of a ritualistic feel. She was implying that the innocent victims of Blood Emperor Alista Tudor weren't just one person back then. Perhaps a ritual had been held in the room that sealed the evil spirit. Klein was taken aback by what he heard as a scene flashed through his mind. In a spacious and dark room, 3 high-back chairs of different styles were placed around a particular point in the center. And sitting on each chair was a breathless humanoid creature with a drooping head. Among them included Red Angel Medici. The scene became clearer as Klein instantly connected 2 additional matters together. The main ingredients of the Sequence 0 Black Emperor's potion is the uniqueness and 2 Sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics. Blood Emperor Alista Tudor had apparently forcefully jumped from the Black Emperor pathway's Sequence 1 Prince of Disorder to the Red Priest Sequence 0, which wasn't a neighboring pathway. As a result, he became a half-crazy true god. As his thoughts whirred, Klein quickly had a theory. This room had once held a Sequence 0 advancement ritual needed for a true god. Of course, according to the complicated ritual needed by a Black Emperor, this was only part of the requirement. The pathway that represented war had clearly required the entire continent to be in chaos and at war to match in scale. And Blood Emperor Alista Tudor doesn't have the corresponding Sequence 1 Beyonder characteristic, so his Red Priest potion requires 3 Sequence 1 angels or sealed artifacts to provide him with the Beyonder characteristics. There happens to be 3 high-back chairs here. Yes, the evil spirit suspected to be Red Angel Medici said that to help it escape its seal, one should find direct descendants of the Sauron, Einhorn, and Medici family, and then extract 10 milliliters of blood and mix them with holy water. Sauron and Einhorn wield the Hunter pathway and are also angel families of the Red Priest Beyonder pathway. They've existed since the 4th epoch to this day. One of them has already waned, only capable of controlling the spy network and a military faction in Intis, while the other remains the royal family of Fasak. Thoughts flashed through Klein's mind as he had a new belief regarding what had happened in the room, as well as the true identity of the evil spirit. On the other 2 high-back chairs sat the ancestors of the Sauron and Einhorn families, Sequence 1 angels. Together with War Angel Medici, who very likely possessed the pathway's uniqueness, all the main ingredients of the Red Priest potion were gathered. And that evil spirit is highly likely to not be the pure Red Angel Medici. It might include the remnant psyche and hatred of the Sauron and Einhorn family's ancestors. Man, this place once sacrificed 3 Sequence 1 angels. Before they died, their curses and the ritual itself left effects, making this room become abnormally horrifying as well as sealing it. Thankfully, I reported this to the churches ahead of time to let them deal with it. Otherwise, we might have died here if we relied on ourselves. It would be the same even if Miss Sharon and I advanced to Sequence 4. We would become food for the evil spirit. Klein felt a sense of fear and joy. Meanwhile, he began to understand the reason why the Red Priest card had landed in the hands of the evil spirit. After all, the former highest-ranking members of a pathway were buried here in this underground ruin. The convergence of Beyonder characteristics would naturally lure Beyonders of the same pathway over without any deviations. Furthermore, as Roselle once said, whatever separates will definitely converge, and whatever converges will definitely separate. After Blood Emperor Alista Tudor perished, the true God characteristic he possessed, which is the sequence 0 characteristic, will likely split into 4 pieces. One is the uniqueness, an abstract item or concept, while the remaining 3 are 3 sets of sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics. If it wasn't because of that, the corresponding Beyonder pathway wouldn't have any more sequence 1s when someone becomes a god. Could 1 or 2 of these sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics be attracted, entering the sealed room? This is likely one of the reasons why the card of blasphemy was lured over. The more Klein thought, the more he felt that he had previously underestimated the evil spirit. They live up to being angels who advanced from conspires. Standing under the tree, Klein controlled Senor to say, perhaps it really is a ritual. It's related to Blood Emperor Alista Tudor. The scale and level involved must be great. Sharon added after silently listening, Saran Einhorn, Medici? Miss Sharon is also suspecting if the 3 high-back chairs once belonged to different angels from the details requested by the evil spirit. Klein thought for a moment, and he divulged something through Senor. Blood Emperor Alista Tudor is likely a true god from the Hunter pathway. The card of blasphemy is represented by the Red Priest. Sharon remained silent for a few seconds as though she came to a realization regarding certain matters as she said, that card is gone. She was referring to the Red Priest card which the evil spirit had formerly shown them. Perhaps that evil spirit had long escaped before the Nighthawks and machinery hive mind destroyed this place. Klein shared his theory. And it had taken away all the Beyonder characteristics and that Red Priest card. Sharon silently surveyed the area and said, it's very crafty. It wouldn't leave behind any obvious clues. That's right. The Beyonder characteristics outside the sealed room are clearly not at sequence 4. To an evil spirit who was once a king of angels, they don't have any allure. Likewise for the Red Priest card, it can be understood that it took away the things in the room, but why didn't it leave anything? It's like telling others something like, ha, I fooled you. I've already successfully escaped. Catch me if you can. Wait, perhaps that's exactly what it wishes to convey. As Klein thought, he suddenly found it amusing as he made Senor speak. No, being crafty doesn't necessarily equate to not leaving clues. The sequence 8 of the Hunter pathway is Provoca. At that moment, the red angel that surfaced in his mind had the picture of Anderson Hood over it. Sharon listened silently as she gaped her mouth slightly, but she didn't say a word. Similarly, Klein was speechless. He felt that the Beyonders of the Hunter pathway truly had a crystal-clear style. In comparison, the red-haired Helene didn't appear anything like someone from the Sauron family. However, she was rather talented at provoking Vice Admiral ailment. Yes, back then, the Sauron family members also infuriated Roselle terribly. Klein silently exhaled as he lampooned. The silent mood was soon broken by Klein. Senor looked around and said a joke, perhaps that's the reason why they were captured and brought here. Who was helping Alista Tudor? Sharon's translucent figure asked, but she didn't seem to look forward to the answer. Perhaps it's the 6 deities, Klein recalled the 6 deity statues in the hall. However, he had second thoughts. However, the 7 deities supported the Trunsoist Empire. The Sauron and Einhorn families were powerful aristocrats of the empire. Of course, it cannot be ruled out that they first supported Tudor, and later had a falling out after he went mad. If it's not the 6 deities, does it mean that there are other deities supporting Alista Tudor? Who would it be? Klein thought in silence. Sharon didn't stay any longer as she floated up to the surface, returning to the tree. Klein stored away Senor's wraith, allowing it to enter the gold coin inside the iron cigar case. Then he asked in passing, actually, I've always been curious. Where do the powers of pure evil spirits and wraiths who do not have Beyonder characteristics come from? The spirit world, Sharon answered simply. The conservation of Beyonder characteristics? But the source of Beyonder powers isn't necessarily the same? Yes, perhaps the spirit world itself is the product of some Beyonder characteristics? Klein nodded and looked at the soil beneath his feet. I'll continue investigating the whereabouts of the evil spirit. I'll inform you if there's anything. He planned on asking Rhodes later. With that said, he took out a pen and paper, scribbled down the method to summoning his messenger, and handed it over. You can write to me if there's anything. Sharon received the piece of paper and seriously looked at it. I'll be in the Bravehearts bar. Letters can be mailed to 126 Guard Street, Hillston Borough. Address it to Ma'am Merriam. All right. Klein stuffed his pen into his pocket. In front of Sharon, he used a ritualistic dagger to create a wall of spirituality and resealed the iron cigar case. Following that, he crossed the street to stop a carriage like a gentleman, sending Sharon all the way back to the Backland Bridge area. After doing this, he returned to the high-end hotel in Hillston Borough. Midway, he changed his appearance and switched carriages. By him. Inside the seaweed bar. Danitz, who had spent some time drifting at sea, once again stepped back into the city of generosity. He planned on helping the resistance handle some matters. He pressed down on his cap, sat at the corner of the bar counter, and prepared to first hear about the recent news. He didn't wish to become a bounty reward due to untimely or inaccurate intelligence. At this moment, he heard an adventurer beside him say to his companion, "Hey, do you think Gairman Sparrow will get someone to claim Admiral of Blood's bounty on his behalf?" Danitz subconsciously looked up, looking at the speaker with a blank, confused look. Chapter 737. Official appearance. Why would the madman, Gairman Sparrow, need to find someone to claim Admiral of Blood's bounty on his behalf? That's not right. Why would he be able to claim the bounty? Danitz suddenly snapped out of his confusion and grasped the crux of the matter. He immediately lowered his head to prevent himself from exposing his shock and confusion. The adventurers beside him continued their conversation. How would that be possible? No one would dare to claim it on his behalf. That's right, unless they wish to bear the wrath of the Church of Storms or selling out Gairman Sparrow. 42,000 pounds. If I can receive that sum of money, I'll immediately head to Backland to be a tycoon. Wouldn't you be enjoying yourself in the Red Theatre for half a year first? Perhaps Gairman Sparrow can claim it from Intis, Fasak, or Fainapotter. Although it wouldn't be as much as 42,000 pounds, it's definitely in no way a low amount. As the adventurers conversed, they began imagining their lives after obtaining 42,000 pounds. They even had a conflict of opinions and began arguing with flushed faces. No way. Are they implying that Gairman has finished off Admiral of Blood? No, although that madman always had the intention of doing so, he lacks the required support that he needs. He needs to work with Captain Anderson Hood? Danitz stood up, pressed down his cap, and kept his head down. He rushed towards the billiard and card rooms where there were newspapers placed there. Just as he left, the few adventurers from before looked at his back and spoke in hushed tones. Do you recognize him? It's obvious that something is wrong with how he was acting so suspiciously. I didn't get a good look, but I think he's a pirate who's here to gather intel. Shall we? An adventurer gestured, slicing his hand across his throat. Perhaps it's someone we can't afford to offend. Let's wait and see. Another adventurer stopped his companion's actions. Danitz entered an empty billiard room, came to the corner, and picked up a stack of newspapers. He quickly flipped through them and slowly his expression twisted. What did that madman do? He really finished off Admiral of Blood? It's only been a few months, and his strength has risen to such a level? Furthermore, the papers didn't even mention Anderson Hood. Danitz was alarmed and thankful that he wisely chose to submit in front of Gairman Sparrow. Otherwise, people would have long seen the news of him being hunted in exchange for bounty money. No. Back then, my death wouldn't have been published. Man, Gairman Sparrow is really a member of a cult. As he thought, Danitz suddenly froze like a statue. That was because he was apparently, likely a member of that cult. The church and military often likes to exaggerate. Yes, it's a secret organization, not a cult. Danitz consoled himself before having the feeling that the organization backing Gairman Sparrow was surprisingly mysterious and abnormally powerful. The successful hunting of Senor, one of the 7 pirate admirals, was evidence. Danitz exhaled as he apprehensively praised the fool inwardly, expressing his desires to handle matters seriously. In a small building near the Governor General's office, Eland and Oz Kent walked out. "It's finally over," Eland sighed as he wore his captain's hat. Oz Kent rubbed his red brandy nose and added with a sigh, "That's right." They had been interrogated while separated for 2 full days because of Gairman Sparrow. They were faced with interrogators who were best at such matters. Thankfully, Eland had never hidden anything from the beginning. He had reported to his superiors that Gairman Sparrow was of unknown origins, but that he was friendly to the military. It had nothing to do with him, since the decision of making this crazy adventurer an informant while having his background investigated was made by the higher-ups. As for Oz Kent, there weren't any problems at all. He had followed regular protocol when claiming the bounty for Gairman Sparrow. As they slowly walked towards the entrance in the middle of the garden, Eland said with a sigh, "Who knew that Gairman Sparrow was that crazy and powerful?" According to the little information that they knew, finishing off Admiral of Blood was just one of the most ordinary and trivial matters that Gairman Sparrow had done that day. And such a crazy person had made the choice of entering the dangerous Banshee to save a few passengers and crew members who had merely expressed their friendship to him. Eland later learned that the dangers lurking in Banshee had far exceeded his imagination. The Church of Storms had directly destroyed the entire place. If I had told the interrogators that Gairman Sparrow has a soft and kind heart, they will definitely think I'm lying. Humans are really a mass of contradictions. Eland silently shook his head. After hearing Eland's poignant remark, Oz Kent replied with a wry smile, "Back then, I thought you introduced me to a relatively strong adventurer. But in the end, he even finished off Admiral of Blood. Damn it. I even think he has the strength to become the 5th king. You wouldn't doubt what I say if you look at the forest and those nearby mountains. That place, it's like, Eland glanced at Oz Kent and finished his sentence for him. It's like it was blasted by the coastal defenses more than 100 times over. That's right. Oz Kent agreed with Eland's description. By then, the two had walked out the main entrance. Eland looked at the night sky with twinkling stars and the dark crimson moon. After a few seconds of silence, he adjusted his collar and said, "Let's hope he doesn't return to the sea again." By him. 6 Sphere Street. Dressed in children's clothes, Denton ran up to the study and said to his elder sister who was practicing her sketching, "Donna, they say that Uncle Sparrow is a bad guy, a cultist, and a murderer. They even showed me the newspapers." Donna turned her head as she wrinkled her nose. "No way. Uncle Sparrow is a righteous, brave, and kind adventurer. We saw it with our own eyes. These are definitely more reliable than the papers." She hesitated for a moment before eloquently saying, "Although he had a very terrifying and ugly appearance, it was the price for his dreams and the power to protect. Denton, remember, the papers often like to fabricate content based on rumors or hearsay." "Yeah." Denton nodded heavily. "I've already cursed them." Donna praised her brother and subconsciously looked out. She saw that the street lamps had cast their light into their garden. It was tranquil, serene, and gentle. Hillston inside a high-class inn. Klein folded a white handkerchief and placed it in his left breast pocket, and he raised his hand to retrieve his half-top hat. Today was the day for the mysterious tycoon, Dwayne Dantis, to officially appear in public. He didn't wait for the sale of the bike company shares or the mystical items, and he planned on first using the remaining £2,962 he had to cover his initial expenses. This was sufficient, as it was equivalent to 6 to 7 years of an upper-middle-class family's income. "A Rhodes didn't enter my dream last night. This means that he's unable to sense my return to Backlund without any close contact. That's a good thing. Yes, I'll contact it with the radio transceiver tonight to inquire about the evil spirit. I won't need to go through this hassle in the future," Klein mumbled inwardly as he held his cane and walked out of the hotel. At that moment, the sun was shining through the thin mist, elating the moods of the pedestrians. Klein got onto a carriage, and he went straight for Sherwood Borough's City Family Servant Assistance Association at 9 Canilowell Street. He planned on hiring an experienced butler and get him to organize the servants needed for a villa. In the City Family Servant Assistants Association, Baylin ended a conversation with a male colleague that came to talk to her. She lowered her head to clean up the 2 drops of black tea on her lotus leaf-colored dress. At that moment, she heard a mellow and heavy voice that time had left its mark on. "Good morning, ma'am." Baylin hurriedly looked up and towards the reception. She saw a gentleman in his 40s, wearing a tailcoat made of silk and carrying a golden-laid cane. Apart from the 3 buttons on his clothes, there was a golden chain that extended into his pocket. This gentleman had a pair of deep blue eyes, and he was good-looking. Even the tiny white patches on the side of his hair had added to the air he exuded. Just a smile from him made Baylin feel her cheeks turn warm. "Sir, how may I be of service?" "All right. How may I address you?" Baylin hurriedly got up and said, "Dwayne Dantes," Klein warmly replied with a smile. "I wish to hire a butler, a good one." "Mr. Dantes, please wait a moment. Have a seat." Baylin hurriedly led Klein to the guest area, and she reached out to point at a cloth sofa. Klein held a smile without rushing or nagging her. He very patiently sat down and awaited the staff to provide him with a list of names of the butlers. "What gentleman?" "Oh no, I forgot to ask him what requirements he has." Baylin raised her hand to touch her cheeks and said, "Mr. Dantes, what kind of butlers are you looking for?" Klein was already prepared as he replied with a mellow voice, "It's best if they have served in a noble family before." This aided Dantes in widening his social circle. Baylin gradually grasped her professional knowledge as she said in detail, "Such butlers are rare. As you know, nobles seldom change their butlers unless they're unable to provide an effective service. Furthermore, even if they aren't able to be a butler, they're able to fill other positions in a noble household. In addition, the wealthy often have a considerable desire towards such butlers, and they're willing to offer salaries with a premium. Mr. Dantes, we do have the kinds you are looking for, but their annual salaries are above £100. That makes the weekly salary to be about £2 and up. An ordinary butler's annual salary is £40 to £80, which is 15 solely to £1.10 solely a week. That appears to be at the level of a technical worker's salary, but the master will provide room, food, clothes, charcoal, and other necessities. A butler practically has zero expenditure. An annual salary of £100 and above is really expensive." Klein quickly did the math as he replied as though he didn't take much notice, "No problem. As long as they're good butlers." Chapter 738, Life of a Tycoon. Please wait a moment. "Would you like coffee or tea?" Baylin asked warmly. Klein laughed and replied, "I enjoyed coffee when I was younger, the rich and fragrant kind, but now I prefer black tea." "I prefer black tea as well." "Then, a cup of Marquis black tea?" Baylin suggested with a smile. The coffee and tea provided to guests at the City Family Servant Assistants Association were ordinary in quality, ranging from low to medium quality. Marquis black tea was tea that Baylin had brought from home for her own enjoyment. Klein wasn't a simpleton, and he was great at observing. Just as he walked into the door, he would take in everything about his surroundings without anyone noticing. He discovered that the coffee and tea container placed in the display case were very ordinary, and he believed that the quality was definitely lacking. Therefore, he believed that Marquis black tea was likely reserved by the association for VIPs, or it belonged to the lady before him. Regardless, it expressed how sincere she was. He didn't expose her as he smiled. "Thank you, you leave me unable to reject your suggestion. How may I address you, ma'am?" "Baylin, just call me Baylin," Baylin said with a smile which resembled a blooming flower. She immediately briskly walked inside, and she selected suitable candidates from her colleague. Then she returned to the reception counter, picked up a tin container, and skillfully brewed a cup of black tea. Sigh, with a good-looking face and a good disposition while being dressed in a way that speaks volumes of my status, I can still sense the friendliness from a beautiful girl even though I'm middle-aged. Klein was having such an experience for the first time as he couldn't help but sigh. This made him further understand the importance of the faceless principle of ultimately being yourself. If he didn't keep this in mind and lost himself to the benefits brought about by his appearance, He would keep maintaining the corresponding appearance, resulting in him forgetting or even rejecting his former self, and he would gradually lose his identity. Soon, Balin carried a white gold-rimmed porcelain teacup and placed it in front of Dwayne Dantes. She said with a smile, "It still needs some time to cool down." Klein looked down at the cup, and he said half-jokingly, "Perfect, this gives me the time to adjust my mood to more formally face this cup of black tea." His compliments and gratitude made Balin feel even better. She found him a true gentleman, one who knew his way with words. "He's definitely not a believer of the Lord of Storms." Balin combed her slightly curly brown hair, and she returned to the room to hurry her colleague. Before long, she came over with a stack of documents and sat on the single-seater beside him. "After the screening, we have 3 suitable butlers. I'll briefly introduce them to you. The first person is Mr. Asnia, age 55. He once served Viscount Yorkville, but after this Viscount had a failed mining prospect investment, his family fell into a particular financial situation, and he had to sell its land and manors while terminating many of its servants. In the past decade, he was hired by 2 tycoons, and he has contributed significantly to the management of their households." As she spoke, Balin's brown eyes sparkled like 2 stars hid in them. She exuded the unique vibes of a teenage girl. Klein nodded slightly and said, "Then why did he leave the 2 tycoons?" Balin replied with a smile. "The first tycoon invested greatly in East Balam, and his whole family had moved there. Mr. Asnia wasn't willing to leave Backlund, so he offered to resign. The second tycoon's health isn't too good, and he had handed the family business to his son who has a butler he trusts more. Mr. Asnia is a believer of the Evernight Goddess, and his political inclinations is with the Conservative Party. He expects an annual salary of £130. May Goddess bless him." Klein tapped 4 spots in a clockwise manner on his chest, forming the sign of the crimson moon. Balin's eyes lit up as she asked, "Mr. Dantes, are you a believer of the goddess?" "Of course." Klein nodded with a smile without explaining further. "It's no wonder he's so gentle." Balin praised inwardly as she continued introducing, "Mr. Reback, age 48. He once served the Negan family, and he was the deputy butler for a long period of time, as well as an assistant to the butler. Later, after a transaction, he became Baron Syndraza's butler. Shortly after Duke Negan was assassinated, Mr. Reback, whose contract came to an end, didn't receive a new contract from the Baron, so he had no choice but to seek our help. He's not a staunch believer of the Lord of Storms, and his personality is without problems. His political inclination is with the Conservative Party. He expects an annual salary of £120. Klein listened silently, nodding from time to time as a response, but he didn't cut off Balin's description. Balin flipped through the documents and took a few glances and spoke again. "The third person is Mr. Walter, age 42. He had been the land steward and assistant butler at Viscount Conrad's household. Due to certain matters, he had a conflict with the butler, and he chose to leave. He expects an annual salary of £115. He's a believer of the Evernight Goddess, and his political inclination is with the new party. Orovie Island's new Governor-General is a member of Viscount Conrad's family. This family pledges loyalty to the royal family." The relevant information quickly flashed through Klein's mind. After the introduction, Balin handed over the stack of documents. "Mr. Dantes, who do you wish to choose?" Klein fell silent for a few seconds before saying with a smile, "Let's do this. Let the 3 of them come to where I live tomorrow at 9 a.m. I'll meet them and have a chat with them to make the final decision." He knew that such associations didn't provide lodging, and it was purely an agency. Even if he made the selection right there and then, he still had to wait until the afternoon or tomorrow to see his butler. Therefore, he decided to have a small interview to select the person that matched his intentions the best. "No problem," Balin said with a smile. "May I know your address?" Klein sipped the black tea, picked up a pen and paper from the table, and wrote down the location and name of the hotel he was staying in. "You just came to Backlund?" Balin blurted out a question when she saw it. Only then did she realize that Mr. Dwayne Dantes' skin was slightly darker than normal. It was slightly bronze-colored, seemingly a result of tanning. It gave him quite a rugged flavor. Yes, he doesn't have a Backland accent. Balin slowly recalled more details. Klein smiled. I came from Desi Bay. I'm waiting for an excellent butler to help me seek out a suitable house and servants. After handing over a 3-pound deposit, he politely drank another sip of black tea and got up to bid farewell. Balin sent him all the way out of the door and watched him board the carriage. Mr. Dantes also seems to be a tycoon. Compared to that, his bearing and gentlemanliness are even more charming. Balin stood in her spot as she casually thought. On the carriage, Klein half closed his eyes as he leaned against the wall, and he couldn't help but calculate the subsequent expenditures awaiting him. The butler will cost around £120. Taking into account the average cost, a valet will cost £35, a chef £30, a gardener £25, a carriage driver £25, a nursery governess £20, 3 ordinary ladies' maid £15, and 3 maidservants £10. This way, just the servants alone would cost £330 a year. It's equivalent to £6 7 solely a week. This already exceeds my salary back in Tingen. Furthermore, I'll need to have a carriage which costs about £100. I need a garden and house, and the weekly rental fee is about £2. With all the food, clothes, and charcoal expenditure for all these people, the overall cost is ridiculous. Is this the life of a tycoon? Klein suddenly felt a little regret over choosing such a persona. He exhaled as he tried hard to ignore the matter. He took a carriage to Phelps Street in Northborough. There was a pure black cathedral here, with a clock tower on each side, producing a symmetrical beauty. This was none other than the headquarters of the Backland Diocese of the Church of the Evernight Goddess, St. Samuel Cathedral. Klein adjusted the handkerchief on his left pocket, held a golden-laid cane, and strode into the cathedral and walked down the quiet aisle. Under the sunlight which penetrated the colored glass panes, he came to the main prayer hall. It was very dark, making one's mood automatically turn peaceful. Klein casually found a spot, leaned his cane, and took off his hat. He then closed his eyes and prayed. Time passed, and after listening to the preaching he slowly got up, walked to the altar, and bowed at the bishop with short, black hair. Then, he walked to the donation box by the side. Exhaling silently, Klein took out 2 10-pound notes, 6 5-pound notes, and stuffed it inside. The bishop caught this sight through the corner of his eye as his expression couldn't help but turn soft. Typically, unless they specially solicited for donations or received donations from a deceased's will, the cathedral's donation box received tens of pounds at most. This meant that the person was a tycoon, a rich person. Chapter 739. The Encountered and the Yet to be Encountered in the main prayer hall of St. Samuel Cathedral. The black-haired bishop retracted his gaze and stopped looking at the middle-aged gentleman in front of the donation box, nor did he have any intention of chatting with him. Here, before the holy altar, he represented the church, and he was under the goddess's sight. He couldn't show more warmth towards anyone because of their generous donations. However, he remembered the gentleman's good looks and mature, refined disposition. He planned on attempting to get to know him when the opportunity arose in the future. Seeing the final note slip into the donation box, Klein closed his eyes and turned to leave. When passing the preaching bishop, he deliberately glanced at the clergyman and smiled with a nod. The bishop returned with a warm smile as he tapped his chest 4 times in a clockwise fashion. Klein wasn't in a hurry to make contact with the relevant personnel. He needed his actions to adhere to logic, and not to have any jarring actions that would incur suspicion. He silently and coolly turned to the side to give way to another devotee, and he made way down the aisle back to his seat. He then picked up his hat and cane before walking out of the cathedral. At that moment, with the preaching done, the devotees either went forward to the donation box to express their sincerity, or they got up to leave without feeling that there was anything wrong. After all, it wasn't compulsory. Even a devotee who passionately donated was unable to donate money every time. It usually depended on the family's exact situation, doing it once or twice every 1 to 2 weeks. At the level of a commoner, each donation was in the form of pennies, while middle-class devotees ranged from 3 to 5 solely. The wealthy and nobles used pounds, but they didn't exceed 100 pounds. This was under ordinary circumstances. During the Evernight Goddess's holy memorial day every year, which was the Winter Gifts Day, the amount donated would increase several times. The commoners with a little bit more cash to spare would choose 2 to 3 solely, while the middle class donated around 5 pounds. As for the members of high society, they directly donated to the diocese bishop or church's charitable organizations, ranging from several hundred pounds to a few thousand pounds. Winter Gifts Day was the day in a year when the night was longest. It was believed to be the birthday of the Evernight Goddess. After leaving the cathedral, Klein stood at the square outside. He watched idly as pigeons flew up, circled around, and landed. He even bought some food from a nearby street hawker. He leisurely fed the pigeons, and he had no plans on flipping through the advertisements in the newspapers to find a suitable residence in Northborough since it was the butler's mission. An excellent butler that had resided in Backland for many years had ought to know the different nobles and tycoons, as well as the best middle-class individuals who could provide their masters with help. He would know which streets to live in and, from there, purposefully choose a residence. The interaction between neighbors was the first step for a newcomer to enter the relevant circles. Be it the Carlton Club where members of the Conservative Party gather, the Club of the Free of the New Party, or the various in-service and veteran clubs for the military, they also require a recommendation before any contact can be made. This is also the so-called club politics in the kingdom. Klein reined in his thoughts as he considered what he should do after he was done setting up the pigeon-feeding persona he created. After careful consideration, he discovered that there was really nothing that needed his immediate attention. This was because his plans were stuck on the surface. Hence, he planned on enjoying an expensive and sumptuous lunch. This was an action Dwayne Dantes ought to have, and it was also a result of Klein's own curiosity. In the months when he was in Backland, he didn't manage to muster the courage to head to the most famous restaurants in the big city to broaden his horizons. He kept choosing one of the 4, his own dining hall, the buffet cafeteria of the Quelag Club, the ordinary restaurants by the streets, and Lawyer Jurgen's dining hall. Otherwise, he would head to Eastborough and settle his breakfast and lunch in what seemed like a very oily coffee shop. Labori Restaurant? Their head chef is said to be from Earl Hall's family. He has provided tycoons, successful lawyers, high-ranking government officials with usually hard-to-come-by flavors. Earl Hall had apparently invested in this restaurant and holds quite a major stake in it. This restaurant mainly serves local Backland cuisine. It's very famous for its desserts, but its price is horrendous. Intis Srenzo Restaurant. It serves the most authentic Intis cuisine. Many of the specialty dishes use Roselle's name, claiming that it originated from the Emperor's Palace dishes. Besides, it's not like most of the restaurants of the same class where they only offer a few main dishes every day. It has a wide variety. Klein recalled the information of the top restaurants he had read from the papers and magazines, and he finally decided on trying out the Emperor's Palace dishes. He didn't stay any longer as he got on a horse carriage and headed for the Intis Srenzo restaurant in Westborough. At the entrance, Klein handed his coat, hat, and cane to a red-vested waiter as he asked, "Are there still any available seats? I didn't make a reservation." "Yes, sir." The red-vested waiter didn't show any abnormal behavior as he humbly asked, "Sir, is this your first time here? Are you alone?" Klein nodded frankly and smiled. "Yes." "Then, may I have the honor of introducing you to some of our most unique dishes and fine wine that our restaurant has to offer?" As the waiter spoke, he led the guest in. "That's exactly what I need." Klein passed through the beautifully decorated door, and he saw walls that nearly reflected golden light. Instantly, he felt as though he was in a gold vault. Then he noticed oil paintings hung on the walls, marble statues that were placed at suitable locations, as well as golden objects that were embedded or adorned in different spots. "Please watch your step," the attendant warned him as he led Klein to a spot by the window. Violin music played in the background of the restaurant. The waiter brought him a food menu and a wine menu as he flipped it open and introduced, "These are our most famous dishes: red braised Tagia beef short ribs, black truffle porcini mushrooms, Inta-styled foie gras. I would like to point out that our foie gras comes directly from the Bonus farm in Champagne province in the Intis kingdom. As Klein listened to the waiter's introduction, he browsed through the menu written in ancient Fasak as the prices caught his eyes. After introducing the main dishes, starters, and desserts, the waiter began explaining how the wines should be matched. Finally, he said, the champagne, red wine, and white wine we have all come from a famous brewery from Champagne province. We even have Ormer red wine from 1330. Its price is £126. If you wish to purchase it, you can take it along with you or store it with us, drinking a cup every time you come. £126. I can already hire an excellent butler with that. Klein smiled with great grace. Your dishes and wine are excellent. It's really difficult to choose. The red-vested waiter gave a hospitable smile. You can choose the chef's recommendations for the day. It will be an authentic and delicious Intis meal arranged by our main chef. There are 3 choices, £15, £10, and £8. I don't want any of them. Klein leaned back slightly as he smiled. I'll have the £15 set meal. All right. The red-vested waiter took away the menus, and he walked towards the kitchen. Klein drew a breath and slowly exhaled as he casually observed the area before him. Suddenly he saw a familiar figure. It was a lady wearing an olive green dress. She was tall, with an excellent figure. She wore a black, out-of-fashion bonnet, with a fishnet veil hanging down and concealing her face. As a faceless, Klein had a strong ability to discern the external characteristics of humans. He immediately identified the lady. Queen Mystic, Emperor Roselle's eldest daughter, Bernadette Gustave. He wasn't in a rush to look away as he naturally moved his gaze to the side. Bernadette didn't seem to notice anything abnormal as she disappeared around the stairwell. Why would she appear here? Right, this restaurant's specialty is Emperor Roselle's palace dishes. It's nothing like the Chinese cuisine I thought it would be. He probably doesn't know how to cook and at best, is able to describe the concept. There are stir-fried dishes here. Could the owner behind the scenes actually be her? Why is she here in Backlund instead of floating out at sea? Hasn't she found hero bandit Black Emperor? Klein sat down with a calm expression as questions arose in his mind. Meanwhile, on the streets, a carriage was driving towards the Intis Srenzo restaurant. Sitting in the carriage was Aaron Series' family. This famous surgeon was a member of the Quelag Club, a good friend of Sherlock Moriarty. He had once sought out the detective to handle Will Ossepton's matter. Ever since his wife became pregnant, he found his luck had become rather good. His business was improving by the day, and his income was rising by the month. He recently successfully completed Baron Sindra's surgery, and he received the commendation of this newly promoted noble. He was invited to the Srenzo restaurant to have lunch with him. It's said that the ice cream is pretty good, Aaron smiled as he said to his wife. His wife was a black-haired beauty, and she was already obviously pregnant. She smiled demurely and said, I'm more looking forward to Emperor Roselle's palace dishes. Aaron tersely acknowledged as he looked out the window. We're almost there. Just as he said that, his wife held her tummy and frowned. It hurts a little. Aaron, who wasn't a first-time father, immediately checked on her and didn't discover any problems, but his wife was feeling greater discomfort. The child in her womb seemed to be pulling a tantrum. I think I won't go over there. I wish to return home to rest, Aaron's wife suggested. Aaron thought for a while and said, I'll accompany you home. He immediately ordered his valet, get down here and head to the restaurant to apologize to Baron Sindras on my behalf. After the carriage began its return, the discomfort that Aaron's wife suffered was relieved. By the time she walked through the doorstep, everything was normal. She pointed at her tummy, exasperated. It appears like he doesn't want to eat ice cream. Chew. In the Intis Srenzo restaurant, Klein, who hadn't spared any dish, felt the pinch but began enjoying his ice cream in satisfaction. Midway, he found his nose itchy as he sneezed into a piece of tissue paper he pulled out. Westboro. In a dark house. Furs, who had already advanced to astrologer, participated in all kinds of beyonder gatherings, in search of the possibility to earn money. She owed Zio £220, and she was even suspected by her good friend of being involved in illegal gambling. I can't even afford to buy my essential crystal ball. As her thoughts wandered, Furs suddenly heard a member at the gathering say, "I wish to sell a moon puppet." Chapter 740, Self-Recommendation Moon Puppet? Furz's heart palpitated as she refocused and looked at the gathering participant who had just spoken. The man in a black iron mask had already taken out a small puppet and showed it to everyone. I have a friend who discovered a series of graves deep in the southern continent's Paz Valley. This puppet was stuck in the deceased's right eye socket. Furs observed the puppet seriously, just like the other gathering participants. She discovered that it was slender, and its entire body resembled a tiny wooden piece that had been engraved with crescent-like eyes and a mouth. Embedded in it were dried grass and flowers. "Doesn't look like anything special?" Furs mumbled inwardly. Her spiritual perception didn't sense anything as her pen-wielding hand continued hovering over a bronze-green notebook. The man in the iron mask continued the introduction. "My friend and I are unable to determine what use this puppet has, and we can only suspect that it's not simple. It might also hide quite a secret. £60. For just £60, you can have it. This price is very fair. Even if it has nothing to do with mysticism, it's not a bad antique worth £40 to £50. That is to say, you'll be spending £10 to have a chance of a pleasant surprise. To you, this is a small sum of money." A very tempting explanation. This gentleman is likely a successful salesman. However, I don't even have £10. As Furs engaged in a self-deprecating laugh, she didn't believe that anyone would buy the so-called moon puppet of unknown origins and usage. Just as she had that thought, she heard a female voice which was deliberately suppressed. £50. Is she too rich, or is she willing to try her luck? Furs subconsciously turned her head to look at the speaking person, only to see the lady wearing a hooded long robe. Her face was hidden in the shadows. At that moment, the owner of the moon puppet laughed. "I'll be more inclined to keep it for myself. Perhaps there might come a time when I discover what's so special about it." As he spoke, he realized that no one was offering a better price. He immediately said, "Of course, as a gentleman, I'll satisfy your wish since you have expressed your desire and have given a reasonable price." "Deal," the hooded woman replied with a deep voice. Soon, the gathering's attendant helped them complete the transaction. Furs noticed that the lady's hand was trembling slightly after she received the moon puppet. She places great importance on the item. She might actually know what's so special about the puppet. Moon puppet? From the southern continent. Furs suddenly made connections and recalled the few primordial moon believers who Mr. Moon was searching for. She began having a suspicion that the hooded lady was one of them, or that she had a connection with them. Of course, she had zero evidence. She didn't even have much of a compelling reason to have such a guess. Furs silently exhaled as she decided to find a way to verify her theory. She casually moved the hard-covered notebook in her hand, making a yellowish-brown goatskin appear. On the piece of paper were all kinds of patterns that formed an ancient, mysterious picture of unknown intent. This was one of the pages of Lamino's travels, and it recorded a particular beyonder power. It wasn't a recorded power which Furs had gathered herself, but one of the 5 original pages when she received it. Furs looked up, and she pretended to observe the transactions of the others while fully taking in the hooded lady's situation. She discovered that there was a mosquito with dark brown spots on a nearby wall and unknown worms that were slowly squirming on the ground. Furz's finger naturally slid across the yellowish-brown goatskin's pattern as a complicated symbol quickly formed in her mind. Silently and without showing any odd signs, she felt that she had understood the brown pattern as her thoughts connected with the other parties. The brown-spotted mosquito flew at a low height. It circled beneath the hooded lady and carefully clung to her front. The mosquito's vision was different from a human's since an incomprehensible scene appeared in Furz's mind. But it soon disintegrated and reformed into a rather normal scene. The hooded lady had a rather curved outline with dark skin. Her brows were thin and the corners of her mouth drooped significantly. Furs immediately recognized her. She was none other than the primordial moon believer, Windsor Bearing, who Mr. Moon was searching for. An effective clue is worth £100, and directly finding her means £500. Furs recalled the reward as she immediately became flustered. Her first reaction was to drive the mosquito to bite Windsor Bearing and suck her blood. That way, she could later use astromancy to directly lock onto her location. However, she gave up the idea after struggling for a moment. That was extremely taboo in a Beyonder gathering. If she were discovered, she would definitely be attacked by all the participants of the gathering. And the host of the gathering often had significant strength. Going too overboard made it easily detectable. I'll just get the £100. If there's another chance, I'll consider how to lock onto her directly. I have to leave this gathering early and smear my blood over Lamino's travels to prevent myself from getting lost. That would be dangerous. Furs repressed her disappointment as she made her final decision. In fact, her actions were already out of line. Hence, she didn't wish to stay another second longer. Hillston Borough, inside a high-class hotel. Klein stood behind an oriel window as he silently took in the crimson moon and thin clouds in the sky. Some time later, he combed the white hair around his temples and reached out to draw the curtains. Then he went through the hassle of moving the radio transceiver back to the real world and spent the time airing out most of its smell. This time, he only waited about 10 seconds when he felt the room turn dark and eerie. He heard the radio transceiver begin to producing clicking sounds. Klein approached and saw a piece of illusory paper spew out. On the paper were words composed of Loanese, "Great Master, please look right." Klein turned his head in amusement and curiosity to his side. He saw a full-body mirror, which had already turned dark, as though it was smeared with a layer of ink. Just as a thought flashed in his mind, the full-body mirror lit up. Illusory fireworks began shooting inside the mirror as it burst and scattered down in a beautiful and dazzling display. Meanwhile, the full-body mirror produced a line of golden Loanese words. "Welcome back, Great Master." At that moment, although a Rhodes didn't produce any sound, Klein had the baffling feeling that it was hysterically shouting. As the fireworks came to an end, the golden text distorted and formed a new line of text. "Great Master, your loyal and humble servant, a Rhodes, wishes to ask you how I might be of service to you." Klein was already very accustomed to this as he said in a practiced manner, "Answer my questions." The golden line of text reformed again. "Thank you for your answer. You may ask." Prepared, Klein said, "Where did the evil spirit in William Street go to?" The full-body mirror's golden text froze for a few seconds before they slowly disappeared. As for the blooming fireworks in the background, they first blurred before a new scene became clear. It was that of an abandoned chapel where withered vines crawled over its walls, and gray stones were strewn everywhere. Klein found it rather familiar. It was where he and Sharon had once conversed with the evil spirit. The scene drew close as Klein saw that in a corner of the collapsed chapel was a tiny pit that wasn't too deep. There were clear signs of it being dug up with one's fingers. Miss Magician mentioned it before. As Klein's thoughts surfaced, the scene produced a cold voice that hid a smile. "It's a pleasure working with you." As those words came out of the soil, the scene immediately turned distorted like a water surface being stirred before the scene completely shattered. "Pleasure working with you." Who did the evil spirit speak to? To make an angel from the hunter pathway use such a tone, the person opposite it mustn't be someone of a lower level. That person might even be an angel. However, why would he use his hands to dig? He should have a much easier method that didn't waste that much time. The angel is also restricted in a certain sense? Just like that grandpa in Leonard's body? Right, Leonard was in Backland back then. This is a clue, but there are other possibilities. Something at the level of an angel doesn't equate to being an angel. The evil spirit controlled Baronet Pound to contact someone? From the looks of it, the Intis and Faceac spies were just a smokescreen that was deliberately set up by the evil spirit. As expected of a conspirer, thoughts ran through Klein's mind as he said to a Rhodes, "Second question, I have 3 butlers to choose from. Who do you think is the most suitable?" Golden Loanese words appeared one after another. If you choose Reback and Walter, there might be an additional development. Asnia is the most professional, but he's also the most ordinary. The two who were formerly under the service of Duke Negan and Viscount Conrad do allow for additional development. Klein nodded in thought. It's your turn to ask. At this moment, a bunch of golden text appeared. Great Master, what do you make of me being your butler? As long as you bring me out of the Church of Steam, I can become the best butler in the world. Klein hesitated for a second as he replied, mincing his words, it's not suitable at the moment. The golden text in the full-body mirror darkened instantly before it lit up again, reforming the words, all right. Your loyal and humble servant, a Rhodes, will patiently await the day. Immediately following that, the full-body mirror produced a complicated picture with some footnotes. This is a rune formed with the corresponding symbols and magical labels. Great Master, as long as you are in Backlund, writing it on some paper is equivalent to summoning me. A mixture of secrecy and mystery prying symbols. Klein identified the rune and said, okay. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.